Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for the story of a man who lived by loyalty and died by betrayal. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the old-school wise guy who took pride in the life, who mentored an undercover FBI agent he believed was his closest friend. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He was real, a soldier of the Bonanno crime family who trusted the wrong man and paid the ultimate price. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? We love seeing this growing underworld of night owls and mob historians across countries and time zones. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you never miss a night in the shadows with us here at Outlaw Icons. Now, take a slow breath, let the world outside fade away, and step into the smoke-filled backrooms of New York's underworld, where friendship met betrayal, and silence told the loudest story of all. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Origins in Little Italy. It began with the sound of dice hitting a table, a sharp rattle in a smoky backroom on Mulberry Street. Someone laughed. Someone cursed. But one man stayed silent. Benjamin Ruggiero, Lefty, to those who knew him, studied the numbers as they fell, left hand still hovering in the air, like a gambler waiting for fate to blink first. That left hand would become a symbol, a habit, a nickname that followed him through life. But long before the dice, long before the mob, before the betrayals and prison walls, there was just a boy growing up in the tight, noisy streets of Little Italy. A boy learning that in this world, survival wasn't about strength. It was about silence. He was born on April 19th, 1926, in Manhattan, in the cramped maze of the Fourth Ward, between the sweat of the docks and the smell of frying garlic from tenement kitchens. His father, Fiore, drove a truck for a living, the kind of man whose hands were always blackened from work and whose voice carried the rhythm of a lifetime of exhaustion. His mother, Frances, kept the home together the way Italian mothers did back then, with faith, food, and an endless string of whispered prayers that her children wouldn't fall into the streets. But the streets always had their own gravity. They pulled boys like Benjamin out of the safety of their homes and into something rougher, faster, and far more seductive. Knickerbocker Village, where the Ruggieros later lived, was meant to be a working-class dream. Rows of neat red brick apartments built for honest families, the kind of place politicians pointed to when they talked about progress. But for the kids growing up there, it was also a perfect training ground for the city's underbelly. On the surface, it was families and playgrounds. Beneath that surface, it was whispers, debts, and deals struck in the shadows of the fish market. You could smell the salt water mixed with diesel and blood as men hauled in crates of fish, shouting in Italian and English. It was there that Benjamin learned the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. Don't talk too much, don't ask too many questions, and always pay what you owe, whether in money, respect, or silence. He wasn't born into power, not even close. The Ruggieros weren't connected like some of the other families in the neighborhood. They were ordinary, struggling, working, invisible. And maybe that's what made the world of organized crime so tempting to a boy like Benjamin. In a city that didn't notice you unless you made noise, the mob offered something louder than poverty, identity, respect, fear, all those things his father could never afford to buy. But Lefty didn't find the mob overnight. It was a slow burn, like cigarette smoke curling under a streetlight, a life that crept in one favor, one gamble, one mistake at a time. As a teenager, he wandered through a world divided by invisible lines. Cops and crooks, saints and sinners, neighbors and soldiers. The line between them wasn't drawn in ink. It was drawn in instinct. You could tell who was connected just by the way they walked, the way people moved out of their path on the sidewalk. Young Benjamin watched them, men in sharp suits and slicked back hair, their shoes polished even when the rest of the block was caked in dust. They were movie gangsters. They were flesh and blood, and they had what he didn't control. Sometimes he'd follow his father down to the docks, watching him unload barrels until his back gave out. Other times, He'd skip out early and linger near the market stalls, listening to the older guys talk. They had their own language, words like vig, action, points. To an outsider, it might have sounded like nonsense. But to a kid like Benjamin, it was poetry, the code of a secret society that didn't need permission from anyone. The idea that rules were flexible, that power could be taken instead of granted, became the seed of something inside him. It didn't bloom right away, but it was there, buried deep beneath all that Catholic guilt and family loyalty. In Knickerbocker Village, everyone knew everyone. The walls had ears, the stoops had eyes, and every old lady knew exactly which kid was headed for trouble. The local priest tried to keep the boys in line, but sermons about sin didn't stand a chance against the shine of a Cadillac or the sight of a man walking into a restaurant and never touching his wallet. That kind of power was addictive, especially to someone who'd seen his father bend under the weight of a system that never paid him enough to stand tall. Benjamin wasn't reckless. He wasn't one of those kids who went looking for fights. He was quieter, sharper. He learned early that information was worth more than fists. If someone owed you, you remembered. If someone crossed you, you waited. It was a lesson that would one day make him valuable to men who measured loyalty not by friendship, but by silence. He watched the older boys, the ones running errands for maidmen, and studied how they carried themselves. He noticed that when they walked into a room, conversation shifted, like the air itself bent around them. He wanted that. Not the violence, not even the money, just the gravity. But every dream in Little Italy came with a price tag, and most of them were paid in blood. The first real violence he ever saw wasn't from gangsters, but from desperation. It was winter, maybe 1942 or 43, and a man on the block got into a fight over stolen ration cards. The shouting, the cracking of knuckles, the sickening thud of bone on pavement, it all burned itself into Benjamin's memory. After that, he didn't flinch so easily. The city had taught him something important. That morality was a luxury, one that working men couldn't afford. By the time he turned 20, the war was ending, but a different kind of battlefield was forming in the streets. Returning veterans needed jobs. The unions were crooked. The rackets were expanding. The Mafia, though no one called it that out loud, was tightening its grip on every corner of the city. And for a kid like Benjamin, who'd already spent years watching the machinery of street power grind men down, stepping into that world didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like destiny. There was something about him that older men recognized, a kind of patience, a way of listening that made people talk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't boast. He absorbed. The neighborhood was full of loudmouths, but Benjamin wasn't one of them. He let silence do the talking, and in a place where silence was currency, that made him valuable. The streets began to whisper his name. Lefty, the left-handed dice thrower who always seemed one move ahead, who could read a man's intentions before he said a word. It wasn't just the gambling that earned him that reputation, though he loved the game more than he ever admitted. It was the way he carried loss. When he lost, he didn't rage or beg. He smiled, lit a cigarette, and said, "Next time," it unnerved people. It was the calm of a man who'd already accepted the rules of a rigged world, and still played anyway. That mix of fatalism and defiance made him a perfect fit for the underworld he was inching toward. Still, he kept one foot in the ordinary life, Sunday dinners, family gatherings, the kind of routine that gave the illusion of normalcy. His mother, Frances, prayed that her son would stay on the straight path. His father, worn and weary, didn't say much. Maybe he knew. Maybe every father in that neighborhood did. That sooner or later, their sons would have to choose between poverty and power. And when that choice came, morality wouldn't be part of the equation. The fish market became his classroom. Every debt collected, every argument settled, every handshake sealed in salt and blood taught him more than any priest or teacher ever could. He learned how to spot weakness, the twitch in a man's jaw before he lied, the hesitation before he agreed to pay. He learned that fear could be managed like money, invested, withdrawn, multiplied. By the time he was in his late 20s, Benjamin wasn't just another kid from the block. He was a man who understood leverage, and in New York, Leverage was everything. The post-war years turned Little Italy into a paradox. Outwardly family-oriented, inwardly ruthless. Old-world traditions collided with new-world ambition. Honor among thieves wasn't a saying here. It was survival. Benjamin's circle grew tighter, and his silence deeper. There's something almost poetic about how the quiet ones always seem to drift toward the loudest lives. Maybe it's because they can see the noise coming before it hits. Maybe it's because they believe they can control it. Lefty believed he could. But even in those early years, there were cracks. His gambling was more than a hobby. It was a hunger. The dice, the cards, the horses, they weren't just games. They were glimpses of control in a world that had none. When the money ran out, he borrowed. When the debts piled up, he borrowed more. Each debt tied him tighter to men who would later own his future. But he didn't see it that way then. To him, it was all part of the hustle, a series of small risks leading to a bigger reward. That's the trap, though. In the life he was entering, there was always another roll, another bet, another chance to lose more than you could afford. By the time Benjamin Ruggiero reached his 30s, he had already shed the innocence of Knickerbocker Village. The world had hardened him, but it had also sharpened him. He'd learned that respect didn't come from how much you earned, but from how much you could endure. He carried himself with that quiet confidence that made people underestimate him, a fatal mistake for more than a few. The same silence that once made him invisible now made him dangerous. And yet, for all his toughness, there was still something deeply human about him. A trace of the boy who watched his father break his back on the docks. The boy who'd seen poverty strip men of dignity. Maybe that's what made him loyal. Maybe that's what made him dangerous. Because loyalty, in that world, was a double-edged blade, sharp enough to defend you, but just as capable of cutting your throat. The years ahead would test that loyalty in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The mentors he admired would become enemies. The friends he trusted would vanish. And the quiet patience that had once been his strength would one day become his curse. But for now, in the bustling, chaotic heart of Little Italy, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was just a man finding his place in the shadows, unaware that those shadows were already closing in around him. The dice would roll again, and next time, the numbers would matter. Chapter 2. Entering the Mob. The Bonanno Family. The first real choice Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero ever made that couldn't be undone didn't happen with a gun in his hand or a deal gone wrong. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that smells like diesel, sweat, and rain on the cobblestones of Mulberry Street. He was standing near a fruit stand, cigarette between his lips, watching two men argue over the price of a shipment that everyone in the neighborhood knew had already been stolen. It wasn't the argument that caught his attention. It was the silence that followed it. One man spoke, the other didn't. And the one who didn't, he won. That was Benjamin's first real lesson in power. Not the kind written about in newspapers or the kind handed down by law. It was the kind you earned through patience, through reputation, through the weight of fear that never had to be spoken out loud. By the time the 1950s rolled in, the post-war optimism that swept through most of America had bypassed Little Italy entirely. The families here weren't buying homes in the suburbs or parking shiny new cars in front of picket fences. They were stacking favors instead of paychecks, debts instead of savings. The neighborhood had become a chessboard of invisible hierarchies. Every corner, every social club, every diner booth had a chain of command. And at the top of that invisible pyramid sat the Bonanno crime family. To outsiders, the Bonannos looked like just another Italian brotherhood, a close-knit group of men with matching suits and matching smiles. But in New York, they were known for something else: discipline. They weren't as flamboyant as the Gambinos or as violent as the Columbos. They were quiet, deliberate, patient, much like Benjamin himself. And it was that similarity, that shared devotion to silence, that made his path toward them almost inevitable. He was in his mid-20s when he first brushed shoulders with men connected to the Bonannos. The introduction came through a bookmaker he knew from the Fulton Fish Market, a wiry guy named Charlie who could make a week's pay disappear in a single dice game. Charlie was in debt, desperate, and one night, he asked Benjamin for a favor, a collection that needed to be made, but one that came with risk. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He understood risk. It was part of his bloodstream by now. When he showed up at the debtor's door, he didn't bring muscle, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He spoke softly. He mentioned the man's children, his business, the way word travels fast in neighborhoods like theirs. Then he waited. A few moments later, the money appeared, folded neatly in trembling hands. Benjamin handed it to Charlie, kept nothing for himself, and walked away without a word. But someone had been watching. Someone higher up. A week later, he got a call to meet at a coffee shop on Broome Street. The man waiting for him was Michael Sabella, a capo regime in the Bonanno family. Sabella was calm, polite, dressed like a banker, but his eyes, cold and unreadable, could strip a man bare in seconds. He asked Benjamin about the collection, about the words he used, about why he hadn't kept the cut. Benjamin shrugged, said he didn't think it was his to take. Sabella smiled faintly and told him to sit down. That moment was the quiet beginning of everything that would follow. Working under Sabella wasn't glamorous. There were no tuxedos or champagne dinners, just long nights of small errands that tested loyalty in invisible ways. He ran messages between social clubs, delivered envelopes, kept watch outside meetings. In that world, patience was proof of trust. The faster you tried to climb, the quicker you fell. And Benjamin understood that. He wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for belonging. The Bonanno family operated like a machine, each man a cog, each decision filtered through a hierarchy older than the city itself. At the top was Joseph Bonanno, a man who blended old-world charm with modern cunning. Beneath him, lieutenants and capos managed neighborhoods like miniature empires. The structure was precise. Bosses gave orders, soldiers executed them, and associates, like Benjamin, proved themselves through obedience and silence. It wasn't a job. It was a religion, and Benjamin was ready to convert. His first real test came during a collections dispute in Brooklyn. A restaurant owner had fallen behind on payments, pleading that his business was failing. Others might have walked in, flipped tables, made an example. Benjamin didn't. He sat across from the man, sipping espresso, listening to every excuse, every plea. Then he reached across the table, placed his hand on the man's, and said softly, "You got 3 days." After that, I stopped listening. There was no anger, no performance, just inevitability. 3 days later, the debt was paid in full. Sabella noticed. Through the 1950s and 60s, his reputation grew quietly, almost imperceptibly. He wasn't a killer, not yet, but he was dependable, what the family called a good earner. He understood the game's rhythm, the subtle balance between fear and respect. He learned how to make men pay without ever raising his voice. And in return, he was given more responsibility, more collections, more introductions. It was around this time that he earned the nickname Lefty. Some said it came from the way he tossed dice with his left hand. Others said it was because he carried his gun in his left pocket. The truth didn't matter. In that world, nicknames were identity, and once one stuck, it became a part of your mythology. Lefty sounded simple, unthreatening, almost friendly, but among the Bonannos, it came to mean something else entirely. A man who'd never hesitate when the time came. The gambling that had once been a hobby became both his blessing and his curse. He couldn't stay away from the horses. Belmont, Aqueduct, Yonkers. He was there, sometimes winning, mostly losing, always chasing the next streak. But even his losses became lessons in loyalty. He borrowed money from his superiors, always paid it back, even if it meant skipping meals or hustling through the night. In a world where debt was death, he survived because he honored every dollar. By the late 1960s, Lefty was no longer just an errand runner. He had moved up to handling his own operations, small-time loan sharking, bookmaking, and street gambling. The Bonannos were expanding their reach, and Sabella trusted him enough to give him territory to manage. It wasn't much, just a few blocks, a few stores, a few desperate men. But in that world, it was everything. Power, no matter how small, was addictive. It whispered to him in the quiet hours, telling him he'd finally become something his father never could, a man people feared, respected, and relied on. But with that power came risk. The streets were shifting. The Mafia was no longer just a neighborhood secret. Federal agents were beginning to watch closer, their cameras hidden in cars, their microphones disguised as light fixtures. Rumors of informants spread like poison. And still, Lefty moved carefully, confident that his silence would protect him. He believed in the code, omerta, the sacred vow of silence that kept their world intact. To break it was to break yourself. Even as the world around him modernized, Lefty remained old school. He wore tailored suits even on hot summer days, his hair always slicked back, shoes polished until they reflected the streetlights. He didn't talk business on the phone, didn't trust paper, didn't smile on photographs. In an age of attention, he was invisible by design. That invisibility became his shield, and eventually, his prison. There was something almost tragic about the pride he carried. To him, being a mobster wasn't about crime. It was about identity. The life, La Cosa Nostra, wasn't just a job. It was a philosophy, a brotherhood that gave structure to chaos. It filled the void left by poverty, by a father's silence, by a city that only noticed you when you broke its laws. To outsiders, he was a criminal. To himself, he was part of a lineage, a soldier in an unspoken army that kept its own version of order. Through the 1970s, the Bonanno family faced its own storms. Internal disputes, leadership struggles, and the constant threat of federal prosecution. Yet somehow, Lefty remained steady through it all. He wasn't a man who sought headlines or glory. He stayed low, did his work, kept his mouth shut. That kind of man was invaluable. You could trust him to show up. You could trust him to say nothing. The deeper he went, the more detached he became from the world outside the mob. His family, though loyal, began to feel like background noise. His wife's worry, his children's questions, none of it penetrated the code he lived by. Every dollar he earned went back into the cycle of bets, collections, and debts. Money wasn't a goal, it was fuel. The only thing that mattered was the life itself. That blind devotion was what made him both admirable and doomed. Michael Sabella became not just a superior, but a kind of surrogate father, one who demanded results instead of affection. Lefty thrived under that structure. It was simple, predictable. You followed orders, you got respect. You disobeyed, you disappeared. There was clarity in that, and clarity was something Benjamin had craved since childhood. It wasn't long before he began to see the other side of that clarity, the part where survival meant sacrifice. He watched friends vanish overnight, either killed or imprisoned. He attended funerals that were more like warnings. The life had rules, and those rules didn't bend for anyone. But still he stayed, because in a city full of noise, this life was the only place that made sense to him. The Bonanno family's hold on New York grew stronger through the rackets that funded its empire: construction, gambling, extortion. Lefty's role grew too. He was now running crews, managing money, enforcing rules. His loyalty was unquestioned. When men whispered about who could be trusted, his name came up with reverence. Lefty's solid, they'd say. He won't flip. He won't fold. And for a while, that was true. But beneath that reputation was something fragile, a debt he couldn't outrun. The same gambling that made him sharp also made him vulnerable. By the mid-70s, he owed more than he could ever repay. Tens of thousands to his superiors, including the underboss Nicholas Marangello. Every dollar he made went a patching holes that only grew wider. Yet somehow, he kept his head above water. It wasn't luck. It was fear. Fear of failing. Fear of losing his place in the only world that had ever accepted him. Still, the debt carried weight. In the Mafia, debt was leverage. It made you controllable. And when Lefty couldn't pay, they didn't threaten him. They gave him work. More collections, more risk, more exposure. The deeper he went, the less he could ever leave. That's how the life held men like him. Not with chains or violence, but with obligation. By the time the 1970s turned to the 80s, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was a made man in all but ceremony, a soldier whose loyalty was proven in sweat, silence, and survival. His name carried weight in corners of New York most people would never see. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he was respected. And in his world, that meant everything. Yet somewhere deep down, there was a whisper, one that came late at night, when the dice stopped rolling and the streets went quiet. It asked whether all this silence, this fear, this endless cycle of debt and danger, had truly made him powerful, or just trapped. He never answered the question. Maybe he didn't want to. Soon, another figure would walk into his life. A man who spoke softly, listened carefully, and seemed to understand the rules of their world as if born into it. A man who would call him friend, partner, brother. A man who would one day be known not by his real name, but by a name the underworld would never forget, Donnie Brasco. And when that door finally opened, the silence that had protected Lefty all his life would become the very thing that destroyed him. Chapter 3. Rise, Debt, and Ambition. The sound of dice hitting a wooden table again. That same soft clatter that once made him feel alive. But this time, the echo was heavier, the smoke thicker, the crowd smaller. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero leaned forward, eyes sharp, face unreadable, as the numbers came up against him again. Another loss. He didn't even flinch, just lit another cigarette, the tip glowing like a dying ember in the dim light of the backroom. Around him, the other men murmured, some pity, some smug satisfaction, but Lefty stayed silent. Because in the life he'd chosen, showing pain was the same as showing weakness. And weakness was fatal. The dice rolled again, and so did his life, forward, deeper, into the web of ambition and debt that would soon own him completely. By the mid-1970s, Lefty had carved out a solid name for himself in the Bonanno family. He wasn't the most feared or the richest, but he was respected. A working soldier, the kind of man who didn't ask questions, didn't make excuses, and always showed up. The higher-ups liked that about him. His calm, his reliability, his silence. In a family filled with loudmouths, hustlers, and dreamers, Lefty was something rare, consistent. But behind that quiet discipline was a habit that was slowly eating through him from the inside. He couldn't stop gambling. The horses were his downfall, always had been. It wasn't just the thrill of it. It was the illusion of control. The idea that maybe, for once in his life, luck would bend his way. Every gambler tells himself the same story, that the next race will fix everything, that the odds are due to swing back, that the universe owes him one. For Lefty, those delusions became doctrine. He studied racing forms like a priest studying scripture, memorizing bloodlines, weather patterns, jockey weights. He knew the game inside out, and still, the house always won. When the debts started piling up, he told himself it was temporary. He'd make it back. He always did. But this time, the hole was too deep. 50,000 became 80. 80 became 160. By the time he realized it, he was drowning. And the man he owed wasn't a bookie from the corner. It was Nicholas Marangello, the underboss of the Bonanno family. Debt, in the Mafia, wasn't just money. It was leverage. It meant someone owned a piece of you, a piece that could be called in any time, any way. Lefty wasn't stupid. He knew what that kind of debt meant. He could have walked away, disappeared, reinvented himself somewhere far from Mulberry Street. But the life had its hooks in him too deep. The mob wasn't a job you quit. It was a blood oath you lived and died by. So, he did what soldiers do. He worked harder. He hustled day and night, running games, making collections, skimming just enough from side bets to survive. Every dollar he earned went toward shrinking the hole, but it never seemed to get smaller. It was like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with your bare hands. And yet, in that struggle, something inside him hardened. The desperation turned into ambition. He started seeing the game differently, not as chaos, but as structure. The Mafia wasn't a world of luck. It was a system of power, favors, and patience. Every man had his place, and the only way to rise was to prove you could handle more than the next guy. Lefty decided he wasn't going to drown in debt. He was going to climb out of it. But in the world he lived in, every climb came with blood on the rungs. To the younger guys on the street, he was a role model. He dressed sharp, spoke soft, carried himself with that rare kind of confidence that only comes from surviving long enough to stop fearing death. They saw him as a real gangster, old school, disciplined, a man of the code. He didn't talk big like the flashy ones. He let his presence do the talking. But beneath the surface, he was breaking apart, caught between pride and desperation, between the image he projected and the reality he lived. He spent nights sitting in the corner booth of the social club, cigarette smoke coiling above his head like a ghost, the sound of laughter and deals humming around him. He listened more than he spoke. That was his gift. People told him things because he didn't interrupt. He was a mirror, reflecting back their words with calm nods and quiet eyes. But every night, when the place closed and the lights dimmed, he was left alone with the numbers, the debts, the losses, the ghosts. There's something tragic about men like Lefty. They live their lives believing they're in control, when in truth, they're just passengers in a car with no brakes. He'd seen friends vanish overnight, some in prison, others in graves, and yet he kept chasing the same dream, the same illusion of respect and stability that the mob promised but never delivered. He wasn't naive. He knew what the life really was. But he couldn't let it go, because without it, he was nothing, just another poor kid from Knickerbocker Village who'd been forgotten by the city. The Bonanno family had always prided itself on being more disciplined than the others. But by the 70s, cracks were beginning to show. Factions formed. Old loyalties shifted. The younger soldiers were restless, hungry for money and recognition. They started cutting corners, breaking rules. And Lefty, though he didn't like it, found himself caught between generations. He was too old to play reckless, too proud to fade quietly. He wanted one thing that had eluded him for decades, to be a made man, officially inducted, protected by the code, honored by the family. It wasn't about ego. It was about legitimacy. Being made meant you were untouchable. It meant you'd finally arrived. But the rule was clear. No man could be made while in debt. And Lefty's debt wasn't small. The bosses knew it. Marangelo knew it. But they also knew something else. Lefty's loyalty was absolute. He'd never broken his word. He'd never snitched. He'd taken beatings for others and never said a name. In a world where trust was rarer than gold, that made him valuable. So, instead of punishment, they gave him opportunity. They told him he could work off the debt. And he did, tirelessly. He started managing gambling rings across Manhattan, collecting on overdue payments, running low-stakes card games for the family. He was efficient, reliable, and for the first time in a long time, the numbers started to turn in his favor. But the life had a cruel sense of humor. Every win came with a loss. For every dollar he earned, there was another bet, another temptation, another hole to fill. He wasn't chasing money anymore. He was chasing equilibrium. At night, when the clubs closed and the city went quiet, he'd walk home through the narrow streets of Little Italy, his shoes clicking on the wet pavement. He'd pass the churches, the bakeries, the same tenements where he'd grown up, the same stoops where he used to sit as a kid, watching the wise guys stroll by. He'd think about how far he'd come, and yet how trapped he still was. The life gave him power, but it also took away every exit. He couldn't go back. He couldn't move forward. He could only stand still. And in that world, standing still meant falling behind. The old-timers like to say that the mob was like the ocean, beautiful from a distance, deadly up close. The tide gave and the tide took, and no man could fight its pull. Lefty had learned to ride that tide, but lately, the waves were growing rougher. The new generation didn't play by the old rules. They didn't respect silence. They wanted flash, cars, money, headlines. Lefty hated it. He thought it cheapened the life, turned something sacred into something vulgar. But deep down, he also envied it. Because no matter how long he'd been around, no matter how many jobs he did right, he was still waiting for that one ceremony, that one moment that would make it all worth it. He'd started to believe that being made would fix everything. The debt, the insecurity, the ghosts. It was the dream that kept him alive through every disappointment. And when he finally got word that the bosses were considering him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It came quietly, through whispers at the club, through nods and half-smiles. "They're watching you," someone said. "Keep your nose clean, keep working hard. You'll get there." But in the life, timing is everything. And Lefty's timing had always been cursed. As he clawed his way toward respect, the Bonanno family was tearing itself apart. Carmine Galante, the powerful boss who ruled with terror and ambition, was making enemies faster than he could count. The streets buzzed with tension. Friends stopped trusting friends. Meetings ended in whispers. It was the beginning of a storm that would soon sweep everyone up, including Lefty. Still, he kept working, because that's what soldiers do. They don't question orders. They don't chase rumors. They just show up and do their part. And Lefty did, right up until the day Galante's body was found sprawled across a patio in Bushwick, cigars still clenched between his teeth. The assassination sent shockwaves through the underworld, and for a brief moment, Lefty thought his luck might change. The old boss was dead. New power was rising. New opportunities. But he didn't yet realize that every new beginning in the Mafia was just another chance to fall deeper. His debt, though still a burden, began to shrink under his relentless work. Marangello started easing the pressure, giving him breathing room. But with that came bigger jobs, higher stakes, more danger. He wasn't just collecting from deadbeats anymore. He was mediating disputes between soldiers, settling issues that could turn violent. It was a delicate dance, one that required intuition and nerve. And Lefty had both. There was a certain poetry to how he handled business. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He spoke in metaphors, in parables. If someone owed money, he'd say, "You don't pay a man, you pay respect." And respect's the only thing that keeps you breathing. People listened because he spoke truth, and in their world, truth was the rarest currency. But for all his wisdom, for all his street cunning, he couldn't see the trap closing in on him. Debt, power, and ambition, they were threads of the same noose. The more he chased one, the tighter the others pulled. And as he worked to clear his name, to earn that elusive title, the universe was already setting up its cruelest twist. Somewhere out there, in the same city that had raised him, another man was preparing to enter his life. A man who spoke softly, earned trust easily, and seemed to fit the mold of a true friend. A man who would make him believe, for the first time in years, that loyalty still meant something. But it wouldn't be loyalty. It would be betrayal disguised as brotherhood. The beginning of the end. For now, though, in the smoky clubs of New York, Lefty sat among men he called brothers, unaware that fate had already loaded the dice. And soon, when those dice rolled again, they wouldn't just decide the outcome of a game. They'd decide the rest of his life. Chapter 4. The Power Struggle. Carmine Galante's Assassination and Aftermath. The summer heat of 1979 hung over New York City like a curse. The air was thick, heavy, and restless. You could smell tension in it, like ozone before a storm. On the streets of Brooklyn, men in sharp suits moved quietly, speaking less and watching more. Something was brewing. Everyone felt it. And at the heart of that tension was one man, Carmine Galante, the cigar-chomping boss of the Bonanno family who had clawed his way back from exile, determined to take what he believed was his. But power has a scent, and in the Mafia, it's the scent that draws blood. Benjamin, Lefty Ruggiero could feel that scent all around him. The world he had spent decades climbing was beginning to crack, and he was standing on the fault line. Carmine Galante wasn't like the others. Where men like Joe Bonanno ruled with quiet authority and calculated diplomacy, Galante ruled through fear. He was the kind of man who didn't just want power. He wanted people to know he had it. He walked into rooms as if he owned the air itself, chewing his cigar with the confidence of a man who thought he was bulletproof. And for a time, he was. Fresh out of prison, he moved fast, reclaiming his position, expanding his operations, cutting deals without permission. To the younger soldiers, he looked like a god. To the old guard, he looked like a ticking bomb. And Lefty knew what happened when bombs went off in this world. No one came out clean. At first, Galani's rise seemed like good news. The family had been fractured after years of infighting and federal heat. The old boss, Joseph Bonanno, had vanished into retirement, leaving behind a mess of factions and grudges. Galani was supposed to bring order, to restore the family's strength. Instead, he turned it into a battlefield. He trusted no one, feared everyone, and made enemies faster than the organization could bury them. He brought in Sicilian loyalists, the Zips, as the old-timers called them, young, hungry men straight from Palermo who didn't play by the same rules. They were ruthless, loyal only to Galani, and they operated like ghosts. Lefty didn't like them. Nobody did. You could feel their presence before you saw them, cold, detached, all business. They were soldiers without roots, and to men like Lefty, that made them dangerous. Everywhere Lefty went, people whispered. Meetings at the rave night. Late-night calls. Faces that used to smile now looked away. You didn't need to be a genius to see what was happening. The family was splitting. On one side stood Galani, drunk on power and ambition. On the other stood the loyalist to the imprisoned boss, Philip "Rusty" Rostelli, who was still running the family quietly from behind bars. And between them stood soldiers like Lefty, men who just wanted to survive. He'd seen this pattern before. It always started the same way: pride, paranoia, betrayal. And it always ended with blood on the street. Lefty stayed close to his capo, Michael Sabella, who had thrown his weight behind Rostelli. Sabella was old school, the kind of mobster who believed in order, in the chain of command. Galanti's reckless power plays disgusted him. And for Lefty, that was enough. Loyalty wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. When your captain stood on one side, so did you. Even if it meant dying for someone else's mistake. That was the code, the unspoken rule that had kept the Mafia alive for generations. You don't ask why. You don't switch sides. You stay with your people until the end. And so Lefty found himself part of silent rebellion, a resistance against a man who thought he was untouchable. There are no speeches, no oaths, just quiet conversations in back rooms, nervous glances exchanged over espresso cups, coded phone calls in the middle of the night. Everyone knew it was coming. The only question was when. You don't kill a boss without permission. Not in New York, not ever. The commission, the council that governed the 5 families, had to give its blessing. And when they did, it was like a death warrant signed in whispers. Galani had crossed too many lines, insulted too many powerful men. He'd become a liability to everyone. And in a mafia, liabilities get buried. On July 12, 1979, the order came down. Galani was to be removed, permanently. The job was to be clean, quick, final. The details were handled by trusted men, soldiers whose names would never be spoken again in public. That morning, the streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace but like anticipation. Lefty was nowhere near the scene, but he didn't have to be. In the life, news traveled faster than sound. By the time the shots rang out in the back courtyard of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, the message had already spread like wildfire through every social club in the city. Carmine Galani sat at an outdoor table, enjoying lunch with a few close associates. The sun was bright. The food was good. The cigar, as always, burned between his fingers. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. 3 masked men burst in through the side gate, guns drawn, moving with surgical precision. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. In less than 10 seconds, it was over. Galani was thrown back in his chair, bullets tearing through his chest and face. His cigar landed beside him, still smoking. The men who had come with him lay dead or dying, and the killers were gone before the neighbors could even reach their windows. The photographs hit the newspapers within hours. The infamous image of Galanti's lifeless body, slumped in his chair, the cigar still clinging to his hand. To the public, it was another gruesome chapter in New York's never-ending mob wars. But to the men in the life, it was a message. The commission was still in control. No one, not even a boss, was untouchable. For Lefty and the rest of the Bonanno family, it meant something more. The storm had broken. The family could finally breathe again, or so they thought. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with fear and speculation. Some celebrated quietly, others looked over their shoulders. The Zips scattered, retreating into the shadows. The old guard reemerged, aligning themselves under Rostelli's leadership. Meetings resumed. Operations restarted. And in the middle of it all, men like Lefty worked overtime to prove their loyalty to the new order. There were debts to settle, both financial and personal. Old grudges that had been buried under Galanti's reign began to surface. Everyone owed someone, and everyone wanted their due. Lefty's world became busier than ever. Collections, sit-downs, endless nights spent navigating the delicate web of politics that defined the post-Galanti Bonanno family. He moved carefully, spoke less than usual, and watched the shifting alliances with quiet calculation. Power, he realized, wasn't just about who gave the orders. It was about who survived the chaos long enough to keep giving them. He'd seen too many men rise fast and fall faster. The trick wasn't climbing the ladder. It was staying on it while the world burned beneath you. The Bonannos were trying to rebuild their structure to present a united front. Rusty Rostelli, though still locked up, ran things from behind bars with the help of trusted captains like Dominic Sonny Black, Napolitano, and Michael Sabella. Lefty, being part of Sabella's crew, stayed close to the action. Sonny Black was different from most capos. Calm, methodical, but with a quiet ruthlessness that made people listen. Lefty admired him. He saw in Sonny a version of himself that had climbed higher, survived longer. Together, they represented the old ways, the ones that valued respect over flash, silence over noise. But even with Galanti gone, the family wasn't healed. It never really healed. Power, once divided, never fully returns to its source. The Zips might have scattered, but they hadn't vanished. They lingered in the corners of Brooklyn, waiting, watching, biding their time. Lefty could feel it, that creeping sense that the war wasn't over, only paused. He'd seen this cycle too many times. Peace that felt like a prelude, calm that hummed with danger. And deep down, he knew something else was coming. Something worse. For a while, though, life went on. The clubs filled again. The laughter returned, cautious but real. Business was good, or at least steady. Lefty was earning, paying down what remained of his debts, gaining back the confidence he'd lost in those desperate years. He walked through Little Italy like a man reborn, greeting old friends, shaking hands, sharing quiet smiles. He was respected now, maybe even feared a little. And yet, every night, when he sat alone in his apartment, he could feel the weight pressing on his chest, the unshakable truth that in this world, peace was only ever temporary. The aftermath of Galanti's murder rippled through the entire city. The commission had reasserted control, but the violence had left scars. The families had learned a lesson, one they wouldn't forget soon. Too much ambition kills faster than any bullet. Lefty took that lesson to heart. He'd spent his life walking the line between ambition and survival. And this was the reminder of what happens when you lean too far toward either side. He told himself he'd stay balanced, that he'd be smarter this time, that he'd keep his head down and focus on what mattered. But fate had other plans. The Bonanno family was changing, evolving into something more secretive, more cautious. And Lefty was adapting with it. He started taking on younger associates, men who could run errands and bring in fresh money. He became a mentor of sorts, a bridge between the old Mafia and the new generation. He didn't talk much about it, but there was pride in the way he carried himself now. He'd survived the purge, the chaos, the shifting tides. In a world built on betrayal, survival was the closest thing to victory. But survival comes at a price. Every death leaves a ghost, and every ghost lingers. Galanti's shadow hung over the family long after his body was gone. His loyalists whispered about revenge, about unfinished business. The Zips kept their distance, but their loyalty to the old boss hadn't vanished. Lefty knew that one wrong word, one misplaced trust, could pull them all back into the fire. And yet, In those quiet nights at the club, with the sound of dice in the background and the low hum of conversation filling the room, he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind him. He couldn't have been more wrong, because even as he sat there, laughing softly with his crew, a new kind of storm was gathering, one that wouldn't come from rival factions or Sicilian gunmen, but from somewhere no one in the Mafia ever expected, from the government itself, from men with badges and patience, from someone who would walk into his life under false pretenses, smile, shake his hand, and call him friend. But that day was still ahead. For now, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was exactly where he thought he belonged, at the center of the Bonanno world, a survivor of another bloody chapter, a loyal soldier rebuilding his family's empire. The ghosts of Galante's reign still whispered in the corners of his mind, but he ignored them. The dice had rolled, and for once, they'd come up in his favor. He didn't know that the next roll would change everything. Chapter 5. The Three Capos Murder. May 5th, 1981. The night was thick with the kind of silence that only comes before something irreversible. Inside a small Brooklyn social club, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and nerves. Men who had killed without blinking were now glancing at each other with unease. The city outside moved as usual, cars honking, dogs barking, life going on. But in that one room, history was waiting to happen. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero leaned against the wall, his hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes steady. He had seen violence before. He had seen men die for less than a whisper. But tonight was different. Tonight wasn't just about death. It was about resetting the balance of power in the Bonanno family. It was about sending a message so loud it didn't need to be spoken. For years, the Bonannos had lived under the weight of internal war. The ghosts of Carmine Galante still haunted every backroom, every whispered conversation. Factions had formed again, this time more dangerous than before. On one side were the loyalists, the men still following orders from Philip Rusty Rostelli, the official boss running things from a prison cell. On the other side were the rebels, three powerful capos who wanted to take the family for themselves: Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Dominic Big Trin Trinchera, and Philip Giacone. Together, they were strong, ruthless, and tired of being ruled by men who weren't on the street. They wanted control. But in the Mafia, wanting control and taking it were two very different things. The Bonanno family had always been defined by hierarchy. When that structure cracked, blood followed. These three capos had begun holding secret meetings, plotting Rostelli's overthrow, promising their soldiers more money, more freedom, more territory. They believed the old ways were dying, that the commission was losing its grip, that a new generation could take over the streets. But to the loyalists, especially Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano and his crew, it was blasphemy. And for Lefty, who had survived too many storms to gamble now, it was suicide. He knew what happened to men who challenged the chain of command. They didn't get demoted. They disappeared. It started as a rumor, like everything in that world does. Whispers in bars, passing mentions at clubs. Then it became clearer. The three capos were planning to strike first, to kill Sonny Black and his closest men before Rostelli's side could react. Lefty heard about it one night from a trusted associate, and he knew instantly what it meant. There was no going back. Once a war starts, it consumes everything. He'd lived long enough to know that when a family turns on itself, nobody walks away clean. Still, there was a cold logic to what was coming. In the Mafia, the one who strikes first lives longer. Sonny Black moved quickly. He called a meeting with his most trusted soldiers, Lefty among them. It wasn't a loud discussion. No shouting, no panic. Just calm, controlled talk about survival. They sat in the dim light of the Motion Lounge in Brooklyn, sipping espresso, deciding the fate of men they'd once called brothers. The decision was unanimous. The three capos had to go. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, orders came down from Rostelli himself, confirmed through intermediaries. The commission had approved it. That was all they needed to know. The setup was simple in theory, but deadly in execution. The three capos were told there would be a peace meeting, a sit-down to discuss grievances, smooth things over, maybe even reunite the fractured family. It would take place at a small club in Queens on May 5th, 1981. They were told to come alone, unarmed, as a sign of good faith. The message was clear. This was about trust. But in the Mafia, trust was just another way to spell death. Lefty wasn't one of the shooters. That wasn't his role this time. He was part of the logistics, the lookouts, the cleanup, the quiet soldiers who made sure everything happened smoothly. He'd been through this kind of thing before, but even for him, the tension that night was suffocating. There's something uniquely haunting about killing your own. It wasn't like going after rival families or outsiders. This was fratricide, and everyone knew it. But loyalty leaves no room for emotion. When a life demands blood, you don't ask whose. The night of May 5th was humid, the air thick with anticipation. The men waited in silence, guns loaded, nerves tight. The three capos arrived one by one, dressed sharp, smiles forced but present. They believed in the illusion of peace right up until the moment it shattered. The door closed behind them, locking out the rest of the world. Then came the signal, a single word, quiet but final. In seconds, the room exploded in gunfire. The first shots tore through the smoke, echoing off the walls like thunder. Indelicato went down instantly. Giacone tried to run. Trinchera never made it to the door. The noise was deafening, but the aftermath was worse. Three powerful men lay dead on the floor, their blood soaking into the carpet. The war was over before it began. Lefty stood outside, listening from the street, eyes fixed on the windows. When the shots stopped, he knew it was done. There was no celebration, no cheers, just grim silence. Inside, the bodies were quickly wrapped, dragged out, and loaded into waiting cars. The cleanup was methodical, practiced. They'd done this before, too many times. Later, the remains would be buried deep, far from the city, far from anyone who might find them. For years, no one knew where they were. The legend of the three capos murder would become one of the most infamous hits in Mafia history, and for those who lived through it, it would never leave their minds. For Lefty, it was a victory laced with poison. He'd chosen the winning side again, but at a cost. Each of these men had once shared tables, meals, laughter with him. He'd known their voices, their families, their habits. And now, they were gone, erased by the same machine that had once made them powerful. That's the cruel truth of organized crime. Loyalty protects you only as long as it's useful. The moment it isn't, it becomes your death sentence. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with rumors but no facts. The three capos had vanished, swallowed by the streets. Their soldiers scattered, unsure whom to follow. And at the top, Rostelli's faction tightened its grip. Sonny Black became more powerful than ever, controlling the day-to-day operations with cold precision. Lefty, as his close ally, rose alongside him. His standing within the family had never been higher. He was respected, trusted, feared, but something inside him had changed. The old confidence, the gambler's calm, it was still there, but thinner, more brittle. Because he knew something now, something most men spend their lives trying to forget. Power doesn't come from who you kill. It comes from who you survive. The three capos murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. It was the kind of act that reestablished order. Yes, but it also drew attention. Federal investigators began sniffing around, hearing whispers from informants, noticing shifts in alliances. They didn't have proof, but they didn't need it. They knew something big had happened. Bodies would eventually turn up, half decayed in shallow graves, confirming what everyone already suspected. But by then, it wouldn't matter. The family had moved on. In a Mafia, time erases everything except revenge. Lefty moved through those weeks like a ghost. He went to meetings, collected money, cracked jokes, and drank with the crew, but something was different. He wasn't sleeping much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the three capos. Men who had wanted more, just like he once had. He'd tell himself they got what they deserved, that they'd broken the rules, endangered the life. And yet, the image lingered, because deep down, he knew it could just as easily have been him on that floor. One wrong bet, one wrong word, and the same machine that had spared him could have turned its gun on him. That thought haunted him, but it also hardened him. If the life was going to chew him up, he'd make sure it took longer than anyone else. He'd survived too much to die quietly. So, he doubled down on loyalty, to Sonny Black, to the family, to the code. He worked harder, earned more, pushed deeper into the business. It was all he knew how to do. But fate, as always, was 2 steps ahead. Because while Lefty was solidifying his place in the hierarchy, another player was entering the stage, a quiet, unassuming man who would change everything. Joseph Pistone, a name that meant nothing at the time. A man who introduced himself as Donnie Brasco, a small-time jewel thief looking to make a living. To Lefty, he seemed real. Hungry, sharp, street-smart. The kind of guy who fit in easily, the kind you could trust. They met not long after the 3 capos hit, when the Bonanno family was still reorganizing, still cautious about outsiders. But Donnie had a way about him. Respectful, loyal, eager to learn. Lefty saw himself in the kid. And for a man who'd spent his whole life giving everything to a world that gave nothing back, that was dangerous. The streets had quieted after the murders, but beneath the calm, new currents were moving. The old wars had ended, but a new one far more devastating, was about to begin. The Bonannos had survived internal betrayal, rival hits, and leadership wars. What they couldn't see coming was betrayal from within, a betrayal that wouldn't come from another family, but from one of their own. For now, though, the family was unified again. Rostelli ruled from prison. Sonny Black ran the streets. And Lefty, at long last, had found his rhythm. He was respected, feared, and finally close to the recognition he'd chased all his life. The ghosts of the 3 dead capos had faded into legend, their names whispered only in back rooms and barstools. Life, as it always did in that world, moved on. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the pause between storms. Somewhere in the shadows, fate was already setting its pieces on the board. And when they moved, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero would learn that betrayal doesn't always come with a gun. It can come with a handshake, a smile, and a name like Donnie Brasco. The dice were about to roll again. And this time, no one, not even Lefty, would walk away unchanged. Chapter 6, Meeting Donnie Brasco. The undercover infiltration begins. It started the way most dangerous friendships do, quietly, almost casually, with nothing to hint at the storm it would unleash. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero met a man who called himself Donnie Brasco in the mid-70s, back when the Bonanno family was still reeling from the blood and paranoia of the 3 capos murder. The streets were tense, loyalty was being tested every day, and trust had become a currency rarer than gold. So when a stranger walked into Lefty's world and asked to do business, it should have raised alarms. But Donnie didn't come off like a stranger. He came off like one of them, street-smart, tough, respectful, the kind of guy who knew when to talk and when to shut up. And for a man like Lefty, who'd spent a lifetime surviving by reading people, Donnie looked like the real thing. The first time they met was in a dim bar near Little Italy, one of those places where the jukebox is always broken and the walls smell like 10,000 cigarettes. Donnie said he was a jewel thief, small time, looking to move some product. Lefty listened, nodding, eyes cold and patient. Everyone in New York had a story, and most of them were lies. But Donnie's story, something about fencing stolen gold chains out of Florida, had just the right mix of risk and detail to sound authentic. And when Donnie pulled a small diamond out of his pocket, wrapped in a napkin, it wasn't the stone that caught Lefty's attention. It was the way he handled it. No arrogance, no nerves. Like a man who'd done this before. For Lefty, trust wasn't about words. It was about rhythm. He could tell it was real by the way they moved through a conversation, by how they looked at the floor instead of forcing eye contact, by how they ordered their drink. Donnie passed every unspoken test. And in that moment, Lefty made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He took the kid under his wing. Not because he wanted to, But because in a world built on loyalty, finding someone who reminded you of yourself was rare and dangerous. Donnie didn't push. He showed up, stayed humble, earned his place the way a real associate should. He ran errands, introduced Lefty to people who could make money, helped collect debts. Every job went smoothly. Every deal was clean. Over time, Donnie became more than just an associate. He became a friend. Lefty started calling him the kid, like a younger brother, someone to teach the ropes. He gave him advice about the life, about loyalty, about how to survive in a world that devoured weakness. And in return, Donnie listened. Always listened. That's what made him dangerous. To everyone else, Lefty was just another soldier trying to hold on to relevance. But with Donnie, he found something like purpose. Teaching the kid how to move, how to talk, how to stay alive, it gave him pride. Maybe even hope. He'd seen too many young guys blow their chance because they were impatient or stupid. Donnie wasn't like that. He had patience, curiosity, a kind of quiet intelligence that reminded Lefty of himself back when he still believed there was a way to win this game. They started spending every day together. Restaurants, clubs, bars, wherever Lefty went, Donnie followed. They drank espresso in the mornings, whiskey at night, and in between, they made money. It was the kind of routine that built trust slowly, like cement setting under pressure. Before long, Lefty was introducing Donnie to his circle, guys like Sonny Black Napolitano, who ran things with calm authority, and others in the Bonanno network. To them, Donnie was Lefty's guy, a jewel thief who earned and kept his mouth shut. That was all anyone needed to know. Lefty wasn't naive. He'd seen informants before, seen what happened when the feds try to plant someone inside. They always talked too much, or asked the wrong questions, or flashed money that didn't belong to them. Donnie did none of that. He lived a life like he'd been born into it. He kept his apartment modest, his stories consistent, his manner natural. The FBI had trained him well, but even they couldn't have prepared him for how deep he'd go, or how deeply he'd be believed. Weeks turned into months. The bond between Lefty and Donnie grew, both personal and professional. Lefty brought him to family weddings, Sunday dinners, even trusted him with his own debts. That was unheard of. In the Mafia, money and trust don't mix. You never let another man know how much you owe, how much you've lost, or what you fear. But Lefty told Donnie everything. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was pride. Maybe, after years of being used and overlooked, he finally found someone who seemed to see him as more than a name in the hierarchy. To Donnie, Lefty was more than a source. He was a doorway into the heart of the Mafia. Through him, the FBI could see everything, the inner workings of a family that had eluded law enforcement for decades. The language, the rituals, the codes. Donnie wasn't just undercover. He was living two lives at once. And the longer he stayed, the harder it became to tell where one ended and the other began. Lefty began teaching Donnie the rules of the life in ways no agent manual could have captured. How to spot an undercover car by the way it sat too level on its shocks. How to greet a boss. How to show respect without looking weak. How to stay quiet when others talk too loud. He explained omerta, the sacred vow of silence that bound them all. You break this, Lefty told him once. You break yourself. You don't talk to cops. You don't talk to wives. You don't even talk to God about business. Donnie nodded, pretending to absorb it like gospel. But inside, he was already writing reports that would one day bring the entire Bonanno operation down. There's a cruel poetry to how trust works among criminals. It's built on lies told so convincingly that even the liar starts to believe them. Lefty believed Donnie because he needed to. He needed someone to believe in him. For years, he'd been overshadowed by bigger names, more powerful men. He wasn't a boss, not even a capo. He was a soldier, a survivor. And Donnie made him feel important again. When they walked into a room, people noticed. That's Lefty's guy, they'd whisper. The kid's solid. That kind of respect was addictive. But even as the friendship grew, small cracks began to appear. A few old-timers noticed that Donnie never talked about his past in detail. He didn't have a family anyone had met, no childhood friends, no real paper trail. In a world obsessed with knowing who you are, that was unusual. Still, Lefty brushed off the doubts. He'd stake his life on Donnie. And one day, he almost did. There was a night in Miami when Lefty and Donnie nearly walked into a trap. A deal that was supposed to be clean went sideways. Guns came out, words got twisted, and for a few seconds, death hovered in the air like static. Lefty stood his ground, calm as ever, ready to shoot his way out if he had to. Donnie stayed right beside him, eyes cold, steady. When it was over, and the danger passed, Lefty looked at him differently. Not as an associate, not even as a student, but as a brother. After that, any remaining doubt vanished. Donnie had passed the ultimate test. He hadn't flinched. Lefty brought him deeper into the fold. He vouched for him at meetings, introduced him to bosses, trusted him with information that could have ended lives. Donnie even started earning on his own, kicking up money to Lefty just like a real soldier. Every week, he handed over envelopes filled with cash. Lefty would count them carefully, nodding with quiet pride. To him, Donnie's earnings were proof that he'd done something right, that his mentorship meant something in a world that usually just took and never gave back. The irony was almost unbearable. Every dollar Donnie handed over was evidence. Every conversation was recorded. Every handshake documented. The FBI operation, codenamed Donnie Brasco, was already one of the most ambitious undercover missions in American history, and Lefty was its unwitting key. Through him, the Bureau mapped the Bonanno family from top to bottom. They learned who controlled which rackets, who made which calls, who was being groomed for power. And the deeper Donnie went, the more valuable he became. But undercover work has a price, even for the man wearing the wire. Donnie started to feel something that no agent should ever feel: sympathy. He saw the human side of these men, their routines, their fears, their loyalty to each other. Especially Lefty. Beneath the gruff exterior, the chain-smoking tough guy act, was a man who'd given his life to a code that never gave anything back. A man who loved his family but couldn't show it. A man who wanted to matter. Donnie saw all of it, and that made the deception heavier with each passing day. There's a story from that period that says Lefty once gave Donnie a Christmas gift, a simple lighter, engraved with the words "Forget about it." Small, cheap, unremarkable to anyone else. But to Lefty, it meant something. You didn't give gifts in that world unless it was real. And Donnie, for a brief moment, almost forgot who he was. He wasn't Agent Pistone anymore. He was Donnie Brasco, soldier in the Bonanno family, protege of Benjamin Ruggiero. The line between duty and friendship blurred so completely that neither man could see where it ended. But even in the strongest lies, truth has a way of bleeding through. There were nights when Donnie would look at Lefty and see the weight in his eyes, the tiredness of a man who'd spent his whole life running on loyalty and luck. And he'd wonder what would happen when the truth came out. Because it always does. It's just a matter of when. For now, though, the two men moved like shadows through New York, a mentor and a student, bound by a friendship that was real in every way except the one that mattered. Lefty believed he was training a rising star in the life. Donnie believed he was dismantling the very world that had given Lefty meaning. Both were right. Both were wrong. And both were walking straight toward a betrayal neither of them could stop. The streets stayed busy. The Bonanno family thrived, unaware that the seeds of its destruction were being watered daily by its own trust. And in that quiet corner of Little Italy, under the hum of neon lights and the smell of espresso, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero sat across from a man who wasn't what he seemed, talking about loyalty, family, and survival, unaware that every word would one day be played back in a courtroom. The dice were still rolling, and this time, Lefty didn't even know he was playing. Chapter 7. The Deepening Bond and the Inner Circle. The streets of New York had a rhythm only certain men could hear. It wasn't in the traffic or the noise or the chatter of the city. It was in the pulse beneath it, the hidden heartbeat of deals, debts, and loyalties that kept the underworld alive. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, that rhythm had always guided his steps. He knew when to move, when to stop, when to listen. But by the late 1970s, the rhythm had changed. It had slowed, darkened, turned unpredictable. Somewhere along the line, trust had become the most dangerous currency of all. And the man he trusted most, the man he'd taken under his wing, wasn't who he seemed to be. Donnie Brasco, his protege, his so-called brother, was living a lie. But Lefty couldn't see it. Not yet. To him, Donnie wasn't just another street guy. He was family. It had been years since their first meeting, and Donnie was no longer the quiet kid on the sidelines. He was one of them now, earning, working, moving through the ranks. Lefty had trained him like a craftsman teaches his apprentice, teaching not just the rules but the rhythm. When to show respect, when to push back, when to let silence speak louder than words. It wasn't friendship in the normal sense. It was mentorship, soaked in the peculiar intimacy of the criminal life. They ate together, worked together, traveled together. And in a world where loyalty was as rare as mercy, that kind of bond meant something sacred. The other guys started noticing too. They'd nod at Donnie in the clubs, offer him coffee, treat him like one of the crew. Sonny Black Napolitano, now a capo running much of the family's operations, took a liking to him as well. Sonny wasn't a loud man. He ran his corner of the Mafia like a chessboard, precise, controlled, logical. He respected men who could keep their mouths shut and do their jobs without complaint. Donnie fit that mold perfectly. And because Donnie was Lefty's guy, Lefty's reputation grew too. It was as if mentoring the kid had given him new life, a second wind in a world that rarely offered second chances. But the streets have a cruel way of twisting what they give. With every dollar Donnie earned, every connection he made, Lefty's pride deepened, and so did his vulnerability. Because in the Mafia, trust isn't just emotional, it's transactional. When you vouch for someone, you stake your life on them. If they screw up, you're as good as dead. Lefty had vouched for Donnie everywhere, to everyone. And that meant if Donnie ever fell, Lefty would fall with him. Their friendship wasn't built on words. It was built on small moments, the kind only men who live under constant threat can understand. A shared smoke after a close call. A quiet drink in an empty bar after a long day of collections. Donnie would listen while Lefty talked about the old days, about the wars, the bosses, the changes. Lefty would lean back, smoke curling from his fingers, and his voice would drop just enough to betray something like weariness. He'd talk about what it meant to live the life, about how the world didn't respect the old rules anymore. These kids today, he'd say, shaking his head, they want everything fast. Money, respect, status. They don't know what it costs. They don't understand you gotta believe for it first. Donnie would nod, eyes steady, heart heavy, because he knew the cost. He just couldn't tell Lefty what it really was. For all his toughness, Lefty had a kind of sad dignity about him. He wasn't cruel like some. He wasn't greedy. He lived simply, in a modest apartment, his walls covered with fading photos and Catholic icons. His wife worried, his kids drifted, but he still clung to the one constant in his life, the code. Honor, loyalty, silence. He'd built his identity around it so completely that it became impossible to separate Benjamin Ruggiero the man from Lefty the wise guy. To betray the code would be to erase himself entirely. And that's why what was happening beneath his nose was so tragic, because the betrayal was invisible. It wore the face of loyalty. By this point, Donnie wasn't just gathering information for the FBI. He was living a double life so deep that it started to consume him. His reports grew longer, more detailed, each one painting a clearer picture of the Bonanno family structure. Names, ranks, crimes, territories, it was all there. He'd memorized faces, recorded conversations, worn wires under his shirts while sitting across from men who would have killed him without hesitation if they'd known. And through it all, Lefty kept him safe. He taught him how to spot tails, how to sense danger, how to read a room. He was unknowingly protecting the very man who would destroy him. There was a strange poetry in it. The teacher was training his own undoing. And the student, torn between duty and loyalty, began to feel something dangerously close to guilt. Donnie had met Lefty's family, eaten his food, Listen to him worry about money, about getting older, about the future. He'd watched him soften when he talked about his son Tommy, who was struggling with addiction. For all his criminality, Lefty was a father first. He'd buried friends, seen men vanish, but nothing hurt him like watching his own blood fall apart. Sometimes, after a long night, he'd confide in Donnie about it. You raise a kid, he'd say, you think he's going to do better than you. You work, you bleed, and then boom, it's gone. The life gets him too. Donnie would sit in silence, unable to say what he really wanted to. That Lefty deserved better than the life that had devoured everything he loved. The Bonanno family was in transition then, and with transition came chaos. Sonny Black was expanding operations in Florida and Miami, setting up new rackets, bringing in money from drug deals, gambling, and construction. Lefty and Donnie were part of that expansion. They traveled south often, staying in cheap motels, running collections, making introductions. Down there, the sunshine didn't make the business any cleaner. It just made the blood dry faster. They moved money through fronts, brokered deals with out-of-town mobsters, and kept the profits flowing north. For the FBI, it was a gold mine. Every meeting Donnie attended gave them more leverage, more evidence. For Lefty, it was proof that he and his protege were finally being noticed. He began telling people that he wanted to propose Donnie for membership, that he wanted to get him made. In the Mafia, being made was the ultimate validation, the sacred ceremony that transformed you from an associate to a soldier, part of the brotherhood for life. Lefty believed Donnie had earned it. He's solid, he told Sonny Black one night. He's got heart. He earns, he keeps quiet. He's one of us. Sonny agreed, nodding thoughtfully. The process began quietly. A background check of sorts, asking around, making sure no one had any reason to object. No arrests, no family ties to law enforcement. Nothing suspicious. And somehow Donnie passed. The FBI agent had fooled them all. But beneath the growing trust, paranoia was spreading like a virus through the Mafia world. Informants were being exposed in other families. Guys who'd been friends for decades were suddenly disappearing overnight. The bosses knew the government was watching, listening, infiltrating. Every face was questioned. Every phone call could be a trap. And still, Lefty never doubted Donnie. Not once. Because loyalty like his doesn't bend, it breaks. The more dangerous the world became, the tighter he held on to the few people he believed in. And Donnie was at the top of that list. By now, Donnie had become part of Lefty's daily routine in ways that blurred the line between friendship and family. He was there for every meal, every meeting, every moment that mattered. Lefty talked about him with pride. The kid's like a son, he'd tell people. He's got brains, he's got balls. I show him the ropes, he shows me respect. That's how it should be. For a man whose real son had drifted out of reach, Donnie filled a void that Lefty didn't even admit existed. Maybe he saw in Donnie the version of himself he wished he'd been. Someone still young enough to make the right choices, still loyal enough to deserve redemption. But redemption doesn't exist in that world. Only delay. The FBI operation had gone longer than anyone expected. What was supposed to last a few months had stretched into years. Donnie was deep, far deeper than any undercover agent had ever gone before. His reports filled boxes back at the Bureau. His tapes captured the daily heartbeat of organized crime in a way no outsider ever had. Yet the deeper he went, the more conflicted he became. Because Lefty wasn't just another target anymore. He was a man, flawed, loyal, doomed, and Donnie knew that when the truth came out, the blast would hit him hardest. The signs of that looming collapse were already there, faint but growing louder. A photo in a magazine. A comment from a friend. One night, in Miami, Lefty spotted a picture in a boating magazine of an FBI yacht used in undercover operations. It looked eerily familiar, too familiar. He stared at it for a long time, his cigarette burning down between his fingers. "This looks like that boat we used," he said quietly. Donnie's heart must have stopped. For a moment, the whole illusion teetered. But then Donnie laughed it off, smooth, calm, disarming. Lefty hesitated, then shrugged. Trust, once given, is hard to take back. The moment passed. But it left a mark. Life went on, as it always does when men convince themselves they're safe. The work continued. The meetings, the collections, the trips, the illusion of brotherhood grew thicker. The FBI, meanwhile, watched from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to pull the plug. They had enough evidence to cripple the Bonanno family, to make headlines that would shake New York to its core. But timing was everything. The longer Donnie stayed, the more valuable he became. And so they waited, even as the line between truth and deception blurred beyond recognition. Lefty started talking more about the future, about what they'd do once Donnie got made, about how things might finally be good. "You're going to be one of us, kid," he said one night, his voice heavy with pride. "I'll be your sponsor. You'll be under my wing. Nobody can touch you then. You'll have a life." He said it like a father giving his son a blessing. Donnie smiled, nodded, played the part. But inside, he felt the weight of every word. Because he knew that the day he was supposed to be made would never come. The day was coming when he'd vanish instead, leaving behind a trail of broken trust and shattered lives. In another world, maybe their story would have ended differently. Maybe Lefty would have seen through the disguise, spared himself the humiliation. Maybe Donnie would have walked away before it went too far. But in this world, the real one, the path was already carved. They were two men moving toward the inevitable, one blind, one burdened, both trapped in the machinery of deception that neither could stop. By 1981, their bond was unbreakable, and that was exactly what made it fatal. The FBI was ready to move. The Bonanno family was about to lose everything. And Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the man who had survived every street war, every betrayal, every bad roll of the dice, was about to face the one thing he'd never prepared for, the betrayal of his own heart. The friendship that had saved him was about to destroy him. And the rhythm of the city, the one only men like Lefty could hear, was about to stop for good. Chapter 8. Warning Signs and Near Discovery. The thing about betrayal is that it never walks into the room shouting its name. It creeps in quietly, wearing the face of routine. For years, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero and Donnie Brasco had built a partnership that felt unshakable. One man teaching, the other learning, both surviving in a world that devoured trust. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, thin and silent, invisible at first. Every lie Donnie told became a thread, and every day Lefty believed it. That thread pulled tighter. It was only a matter of time before the whole thing began to strain. By 1981, Lefty and Donnie were spending nearly every waking hour together. They'd become inseparable, traveling between New York and Florida, collecting payments, dealing with bookmakers, sitting in smoky backrooms with men whose smiles were always one drink away from violence. Lefty was proud of his protege. To him, Donnie wasn't just another associate anymore. He was family, someone he'd brought up the right way, someone he'd taught the old-school rules: discipline, silence, loyalty. Lefty's faith in him was complete. But faith, in the Mafia, was often just another word for blindness. The FBI's undercover operation had gone longer than anyone expected. 6 years inside, hundreds of meetings recorded, thousands of conversations documented. Each encounter, each handshake, each laugh was stored away in government files while Lefty slept peacefully, unaware that every word he spoke was evidence. The Bureau had built its case brick by brick, patient and methodical. But the longer Donnie stayed inside, the greater the danger became, for both of them. Because in the underworld, secrets don't stay buried. Not forever. It began, as all unravelings do, with something small. A boat. In Miami, Lefty and Donnie were working a deal, moving stolen goods under the radar. They used a sleek yacht that Donnie said belonged to a friend, some connected guy with money to spare. It was nothing unusual. Criminals often shared resources to make business look cleaner. But a few months later, while sitting in a quiet cafe flipping through a boating magazine, Lefty's eye caught something that stopped him cold. There, in a glossy photo spread about law enforcement's anti-smuggling operations, was the same boat, same name, same color, same details. Except now, it was labeled as property of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a few long seconds, he just stared. The noise of the cafe faded. His hand froze midair, cigarette trembling between his fingers. It couldn't be. It didn't make sense. He flipped the page, checked again. It was the same boat. His pulse quickened. He looked around the room instinctively, scanning for familiar faces, for eyes that lingered too long. Then he thought about Donnie, the boat, the deals, the questions he asked, the way he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. The thought hit him like a wave. Could it be him? When he met up with Donnie later that night, the image still haunted him. They sat at a small bar near the marina, the TV buzzing faintly in the corner. Lefty took a slow drag from his cigarette, studying Donnie across the table. "I saw something today," he said. "A boat. Looked just like the one we used down in Florida." Donnie didn't flinch. "Yeah," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What about it?" Lefty held his gaze a second too long. "Said it was an FBI boat," he muttered. "Funny, huh?" The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Then Donnie laughed, soft, easy, natural. "Yeah, they use a lot of boats down there," he said. "Probably just looks the same." Lefty watched him carefully, waiting for a sign, a twitch, a slip. But Donnie's calm was flawless. After a beat, Lefty chuckled too, shaking his head. Yeah, probably." He took another drag, let the smoke fill the space between them, and the moment passed. But not completely. It left a scar, a quiet doubt that buried itself deep in Lefty's chest. Still, loyalty is a strange thing. Even when the mind starts to question, the heart refuses to follow. Lefty wanted to believe Donnie, needed to believe him. Because if he didn't, if the kid he'd mentored, protected, and trusted like blood was a rat, then everything he'd ever believed about loyalty would collapse. And Lefty wasn't built for that kind of truth. So he buried it, pretended the thought had never come. The boat was a coincidence. The FBI had lots of boats. That's what he told himself. Meanwhile, inside Donnie's world, the walls were closing in. The FBI was preparing to end the operation. They'd gathered enough evidence to indict nearly the entire Bonanno hierarchy: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, murder. But Donnie wasn't ready to walk away. He'd gone so deep that his real name, Joseph Pistone, felt foreign. He'd lived longer as Donnie Brasco than as himself. And somewhere along the way, the lines between his two lives had blurred into one. He still wore the wire, still filed reports, but every time he sat across from Lefty, something in him twisted. Because he knew what would happen when the truth came out. He knew what the Mafia did to men who brought the law to their doorstep. Lefty's loyalty to Donnie didn't go unnoticed. Other guys began talking. Some teased him about his kid. Others envied the bond. But in the Mafia, envy is poison. It seeps into conversation, turns respect into suspicion. Whispers began to circulate. Who was this Donnie? Where'd he come from? How come nobody knew his people? Why was he so close to Lefty? Why did the bosses trust him so quickly? Lefty brushed it all off, but the whispers grew louder. The paranoia of the post-Galani years was back, and every man was looking over his shoulder again. In late spring of 1981, the family's power structure was shifting once more. Sonny Black had risen fast, his calm authority earning him respect even among older soldiers. Lefty remained by his side, a loyal soldier, the man who'd handle business without complaint. Donnie was now a fixture in their operations, trusted to handle money, meetings, even sensitive introductions. To the outside world, it looked like Lefty's mentorship had worked perfectly. He'd turned a small-time jewel thief into a made man in all but ceremony. But beneath that illusion, the FBI's case files were swelling. Every handshake was cataloged, every deal recorded, every drop of blood on the ledger marked for indictment. Still, there were moments when Donnie almost cracked. The guilt gnawed at him. He'd sit across from Lefty in a diner, listening to him talk about honor and legacy, about how one day they'd both be retired, living quiet, comfortable lives. He'd talk about maybe moving to Florida for good, fishing, smoking cigars by the water. He believed it. He really did. Donnie would nod, smile, sip his coffee, and inside, he'd feel sick. Because he knew those dreams were built on sand, and when the truth came crashing down, there wouldn't be any retirement, just ruin. Lefty started to notice small changes in Donnie, subtle things. He'd drift sometimes, go quiet, stare off mid-conversation. Lefty would ask, "You okay, kid?" Donnie would smile and say he was fine. But the walls were getting thinner. Lefty could feel the pressure in the air, like the humidity before a thunderstorm. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew something was. It was instinct, the kind of sense you develop after decades of surviving in a world that runs on deceit. Around that time, Sonny Black told Lefty that Donnie's name had come up for official consideration to be made. It was the ultimate recognition. Lefty was ecstatic. After all the years of struggle, after all the blood and debt, he finally had something to be proud of. His guy was going to be one of them. He told Donnie about it with the kind of excitement that only men starved for validation can feel. "You made it, kid," he said, grinning through a cloud of smoke. "You did it. I told him you was the real deal. I told him you'd never fold." Donnie smiled faintly, but inside, it felt like a knife twisting. Because the only ceremony that was coming wasn't initiation. It was exposure. The FBI had set the date. The operation was ending. The Bureau couldn't risk keeping him in longer. The case was too big, too volatile. Soon, they'd go public, announce the indictments, release the evidence. And when they did, the fallout would be catastrophic. Dozens of arrests, entire hierarchies dismantled. But for Donnie, the thought that haunted him wasn't the headlines. It was Lefty. What would happen to him? How would he take it? What would the family do when they realized the betrayal came from inside his own crew? In early July, Donnie was pulled out of the operation. One day he was there, the next he was gone. The Bureau whisked him away in silence, cut off all contact. To the Bonannos, he'd simply vanished. No explanation, no goodbye. When the FBI finally revealed the truth, when they showed the photographs, the recordings, the evidence, it was like dropping a bomb in the middle of the family. Donnie Brasco wasn't Donnie Brasco. He was Special Agent Joseph Pistone of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The man they trusted, respected, welcomed into their homes had been wearing a wire the whole time. The news spread through the underworld like wildfire. Meetings were called. Names were shouted. Paranoia exploded. The Bonannos had been humiliated, exposed to the public, mocked in newspapers, crippled by indictments. Someone had to pay, and all eyes turned to the men closest to Donnie, Sonny Black and Lefty Ruggiero. The rules were simple. You bring a rat into the family, you answer for it. There were no exceptions. When the FBI came for Lefty, he didn't resist. They told him everything, laid out the photos, the tapes, the truth. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned back, lit a cigarette, and stared at the wall. "Donnie," he said softly, almost himself. "You're telling me Donnie was a cop?" The agent nodded. Lefty's laugh was hollow, fragile. "You're full of shit," he muttered. But the photos didn't lie. The tapes didn't lie. And slowly, painfully, the truth sank in. For Lefty, it wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation. Every belief he'd ever held about loyalty, about family, about the code, it all shattered in that instant. He'd trusted a man completely, vouched for him, called him brother. And that man had turned out to be the enemy. He wasn't angry at first, just numb. Betrayal like that doesn't burn hot. It freezes. It stops the world. That night, he sat in his small apartment, the city buzzing faintly outside, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink. He thought about all the years he'd spent teaching Donnie the rules, all the times he'd warned him about traitors, about rats, about men who wore two faces. And he wondered how he hadn't seen it, how he'd missed the signs. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe deep down, he knew that believing in something, even if it killed you, was better than living in a world where nothing was real. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lefty knew what came next. In the Mafia, betrayal is contagious. Someone had to pay. Sonny Black was executed soon after, ambushed, shot, and left for dead. His body was later found decomposed in a Brooklyn basement. Lefty expected the same. He got a call one evening, told to come to a meeting. He didn't pack a bag, didn't run. He kissed his wife goodbye, handed her his watch, and said quietly, "If I don't come back, you'll know why." But before he could walk out the door, the FBI arrived. They arrested him on racketeering charges, effectively saving his life. They'd rather see him in prison than in a coffin. The irony was cruel. The government had saved the man they destroyed. The dice had stopped rolling. And when the smoke cleared, all that was left of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was a shadow of the man he once was, a soldier who'd lived by the code, only to die by its silence. The bond that had once given him purpose had become his undoing. The teacher had been betrayed by his best student, and the student had walked away with a lifetime of guilt. The operation was over, but for Lefty, the lesson remained. In the world of loyalty and lies, it's not the bullets that kill you, it's the truth. Chapter 9. Operation Donnie Brasco unravels. It began with whispers, quiet, panicked ones that slithered through the backrooms of Little Italy like smoke in the dark. Something was wrong. Something big. Nobody knew what it was yet, but everyone could feel it. The Bonanno family, one of the most secretive, disciplined, and proud organizations in the American Mafia, was suddenly tense in a way that no gun or turf war could explain. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had been alive long enough to recognize the smell of danger before anyone said a word. This wasn't about rival families, debts, or power struggles. It was something deeper, something that made men look at their own friends with suspicion. And at the center of it all was a name that would soon bring everything crashing down: Donnie Brasco. The first spark came in the summer heat of 1981, when two FBI agents showed up unannounced at Sonny Black Napolitano's apartment building. They didn't knock like gangsters. They knocked like men who wanted to be heard. They told Sonny's girlfriend who they were. They showed their badges. Then they said something that would echo across the entire underworld. "We're here to tell you your friend Donnie Brasco is an undercover FBI agent. He's been working with us for 6 years." That was the moment the lie ended, but the damage had already been done. The silence that followed that revelation would spread faster than any bullet ever could. When Sonny heard the news, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't even move. He just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process how a man who'd eaten at his table, who'd called him brother, could have been a cop all along. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "There's going to be a lot of trouble now." And there was. The kind of trouble that doesn't explode. It implodes, collapsing everything from the inside out. For Lefty, it didn't make sense. It couldn't. He'd spent years with Donnie, more time with him than with his own family. He'd trusted him with his life. He'd taught him the code, vouched for him to bosses, dreamed about sponsoring him to be made. Donnie was supposed to be his legacy. And now the whole thing, the friendship, the respect, the loyalty, was a lie. The day the news reached him, Lefty was sitting in his small apartment in Little Italy, sipping coffee, thinking about business. The phone rang. It was one of his guys, his voice tight, nervous. "Lefty, you heard about Donnie?" Lefty frowned. "What about him?" The silence on the other end lasted too long. "He ain't who you think he is." Then the line went dead. Lefty hung up the phone slowly, his fingers trembling. He lit a cigarette, his mind spinning, but his face stayed calm. It had to be a mistake. Maybe a setup. Maybe the feds were lying, trying to pit them against each other. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. But deep down, something inside him already knew. There had been signs, small, quiet things he'd ignored because he didn't want to see them. The boat. The questions. The way Donnie always seemed one step ahead. The way he never lost his composure, no matter how bad things got. It was all there, written in hindsight like a confession he'd refused to read. That evening, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't one of his men. It was the FBI. They told him to come down to the office. He thought it was about something else, a bust, a warrant, maybe another shakedown. But when he arrived, they didn't shove him into a cell or read him his rights. They sat him down in a room, slid a folder across the table, and said, "We need to show you something." Inside were photographs, him and Donnie together, at restaurants, at clubs, at meetings. Surveillance photos. Real ones. And then, the tapes. Voices he recognized. His own, Donnie's, their conversations, all captured in cold mechanical clarity. Every laugh, every whisper, every piece of advice he'd ever given, all recorded by the government. For a moment, the world tilted. He leaned back in his chair, expression blank. "You're telling me Donnie's a Fed?" The agent nodded. Lefty exhaled slowly, his voice a low murmur. "I don't believe you." The agent pushed another photo toward him. This one was different. It showed Joseph D. Pistone, the real man behind the alias, sitting in an FBI office, smiling for the camera. It was the same smile Lefty had seen 100 times before. The same face, just without the mask. "Believe it," the agent said quietly. "He was one of us the whole time." Lefty didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at the photo until his cigarette burned down to his fingers. Then he said, "You sons of bitches," and stood up. "You don't know what you did." The Bureau thought they'd saved it by warning him. What they didn't understand was that in the Mafia, there's no such thing as saving a man who's already dead on paper. Once the truth got out, Lefty's life was over. The code was clear. You bring a rat into the family, even by accident, and you pay with your life. There are no exceptions. That's the rule that keeps the entire system standing. And Lefty, a man who'd lived and bled for that code, knew it better than anyone. Within hours, the Bonanno family went into lockdown. Meetings were held in basements and backrooms. Names were shouted, curses thrown, orders given. The betrayal had made them look weak, mocked in headlines, humiliated in front of other families. Every soldier, every capo, every old-timer wanted blood. Sonny Black Napolitano, who'd also trusted Donnie, was marked first. He'd brought the agent into higher circles, vouched for him at leadership meetings, given him access to business. The punishment was automatic. A few days after the FBI's visit, Sonny got a call. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just sighed, told his girlfriend to water the plants, and walked out the door. His body was found weeks later, decomposing in a basement, his hands bound behind his back. It was a message to everyone, and especially to Lefty. Lefty knew what was coming. You don't survive decades in the Mafia without learning how to read the quiet signals that spell death. A meeting that's suddenly rescheduled. A friend who won't make eye contact. A phone that stops ringing. The silence is always louder than the warning. He got the call one night. Simple, direct. "We need to talk. Come down." That was all they said. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough men take that walk. Some came back. Most didn't. That evening, he sat alone in his small, dim apartment, the TV flickering in the corner. He poured himself a drink, his hand steady despite the knot in his chest. His wife asked him where he was going. He looked at her and smiled softly, the kind of tired smile that says everything without words. He handed her his jewelry, his watch, and the keys to the car. "If I don't come back," he said quietly, "you'll know why." She wanted to ask questions, but she didn't. She knew. Wives always know. He finished his drink, put on his coat, and headed for the door. But before he could reach his car, headlights flashed across the street. Unmarked. Two men stepped out. Not mobsters, but agents. The same ones who'd shown him the photos. "You're not going anywhere tonight, Lefty," one of them said. "We're taking you in." They placed him under arrest, not out of mercy, but necessity. They knew if he left that apartment, he'd never come back. The Bureau had ruined his life. Saving it was the least they could do. To the world, it looked like justice. To Lefty, it felt like exile. Overnight, Operation Donnie Brasco exploded into headlines. The FBI announced the indictments. More than 100 Mafia members and associates across New York, Florida, and Milwaukee. The Bonanno family had been infiltrated for 6 years, longer than any other major crime family in history. The operation had cost millions, but its success was undeniable. The FBI had done what no one thought possible. They'd walked into Mafia and walked back out alive. Newspapers called it triumph. For Lefty, it was a funeral. In the months that followed, he sat in federal custody, refusing to talk, refusing to cooperate. They offered him deals, protection, even relocation. He said no every time. "I ain't no rat," he told them. "I don't talk." It wasn't pride. It was survival of a different kind. If he broke the code now, he'd be killing himself from the inside. So he kept his silence, even when it cost him everything. The streets he once ruled moved on without him. New faces filled the void. Old friends disappeared. The Bonannos restructured, rebuilt, rebranded. But the shadow of Donnie Brasco hung over them for years, a reminder that even the strongest families could be broken by trust. To the FBI, Lefty was just another name in a file. To the Mafia, he was the man who brought the feds to their door. To himself, he was a ghost, alive, but hollowed out by betrayal. When Joseph Pistone testified before Congress about the operation, he was asked if he ever felt sorry for the men he'd deceived. He paused, looked down, and said, "Yeah, some of them were killers, but some of them were just human." It was a rare admission, one that echoed louder than any court ruling, because behind all the glory, all the headlines, was a simple, painful truth. The operation didn't just destroy a criminal organization. It destroyed lives built on loyalty. Lefty served time quietly, kept to himself, never once asking for favors or forgiveness. The Bureau checked on him occasionally, sometimes out of concern, sometimes out of guilt. He never said much. He'd been betrayed by both worlds, the one that raised him and the one that saved him. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a man who has lost everything. It's not angry. It's not sad. It's just empty. In the years that followed, when people in the neighborhood spoke his name, they did so softly, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because for all his flaws, for all the mistakes, the crimes, the blood on his hands, Lefty had lived by the only rule he ever believed in: loyalty. Even when it killed him, even when it wasn't returned. Operation Donnie Brasco was hailed as a victory for law enforcement, but for the men inside that world, it was something else. A mirror. It showed them what they'd become. A world where loyalty could be faked, where family could be an illusion, where the code that once protected them could be used against them. It wasn't just a case. It was the moment the Mafia realized its own myth had died. And in the middle of it all stood Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the old-school soldier who believed silence could save him, trust could guide him, and loyalty could never lie. But in the end, it did. It lied with a smile, called him brother, shook his hand, and left him standing alone in the wreckage of everything he'd ever known. The dice had stopped rolling long ago. All that remained was the quiet, the echo of a life built on faith in men who didn't exist, and the soft whisper of a truth that even he couldn't deny anymore. The greatest con ever pulled wasn't by the FBI. It was by the world itself, convincing men like Lefty that honor could exist in a life built on betrayal. Chapter 10. Arrest and Betrayal from Within. The morning Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was arrested, the city outside his window looked the same as it always did. Gray sky, sirens in the distance, the faint hum of traffic crawling down the narrow streets of Little Italy. But inside his small apartment, time had stopped. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table for hours, half-dressed, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, his thoughts looping like a record that wouldn't end. He'd done this every morning for years, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air, the kind you can't see but can feel pressing against your chest. He lit another cigarette and stared at the clock. 10 minutes later, the knock came. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The kind of knock that knows it's going to be answered. When he opened the door, the hallway was full of men in suits, FBI jackets, badges, all business. They said his name formally, like reading it off a file. Benjamin Ruggiero. You're under arrest. No anger, no surprise. Just inevitability. He nodded once, quietly, as if confirming what he already knew. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He just turned around and held out his hands. The cuffs clicked, cold against his wrists, and the sound echoed in the silence like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. The story wasn't over yet, but it was close. Outside, reporters were already waiting. Cameras flashed as the agents led him down the steps, the old gangster shuffling through the crowd like a ghost from another era. He kept his head down, not out of shame, but defiance. He'd lived by the code his entire life, and even now, when the world had turned against him, he wasn't going to break it. He didn't curse, didn't speak, didn't give them the satisfaction of a quote. To the world, he looked finished. But in his mind, the old fire still burned. Betrayal had taken everything from him, but it hadn't taken his silence. Inside the Bureau's offices, they treated him differently this time. No shouting, no threats. They spoke to him like a man they'd come to know, which in a way they had. They'd studied his life for years, his routines, his debts, his friendships. They knew the sound of his voice, the cadence of his laugh. They knew how much he'd lost. And still, they had no idea what it felt like to be him. Lefty sat across from them, his cuffed hands resting on the table, his eyes heavy but steady. "You got what you wanted," he said finally. "Now what?" One of the agents slid a file toward him. Inside were photos, faces of men he'd known his whole life, now marked for indictment. Racketeering, murder, conspiracy. The usual charges that carried weight, but not surprise. He leafed through the pages slowly, expression unreadable. Every face was a memory, every name a ghost. When he reached the last photo, Joseph Pistone, smiling in his FBI portrait, his hand froze. He looked at it for a long time, the edges trembling between his fingers. There was no rage in his eyes, just exhaustion. "That's him," he said softly. "That's your guy." He slid the photo back, exhaled smoke through his nose, and whispered, "He got us good." There was something almost admiring in his tone, as if he couldn't help respecting the man who'd outplayed them all. But admiration didn't dull the pain. For Lefty, it wasn't just betrayal by a friend. It was betrayal by the universe, by the code he'd sworn to, by the very idea that loyalty could still mean something in a world that rewarded deceit. They offered him a deal, of course. The same deal they offered every wise guy who'd outlived his usefulness. Witness protection, a new name, a clean slate. "You talk," one of them said, "and we can keep you safe." Lefty let out a short, dry laugh. "Safe," he repeated. "You think I care about safe?" He leaned forward, his voice low, gravelly, like a confession dragged from the bottom of his lungs. "You think I did all this to end up hiding like a rat? I don't talk. I never talked. You boys know that." He wasn't bluffing. They knew it too. He'd had a dozen chances to save himself over the years, times when snitching could have erased his debts, his charges, maybe even his death sentence. But he never did. Silence was his only religion, and he wasn't about to break it now. They sent him to holding. The cell was small, the walls pale, the light buzzing overhead. He sat on the cot, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of how his life had folded in on itself. All the years, all the work, all the loyalty, gone in a single revelation. And what stung most wasn't that he'd been caught. It was that he'd been fooled. He'd trusted Donnie like a son. He'd protected him, fed him, vouched for him. He'd opened his world to him piece by piece, never once suspecting that the kid was the very thing he'd been warned about his entire life. The FBI hadn't just broken the Bonanno family. They'd broken Lefty's heart. Back on the streets, the fallout was immediate. The Bonannos were collapsing under the weight of indictments. Dozens of soldiers were picked up, old alliances shattered overnight. The Commission, the Mafia's governing council, had lost face. Other families mocked them behind closed doors, calling them sloppy, careless, blind. Inside the Bonannos, paranoia spread like wildfire. Every man was a suspect. Every conversation carried danger. And in the middle of it all was Lefty, the old-school soldier, now painted as the man who'd brought the cops to their door. It didn't matter that he hadn't known. Guilt in the Mafia was contagious. The call that sealed his fate came a week later. He was out on bail, back in his apartment, sitting quietly when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost gentle. "Lefty," it said, "you gotta come down. We need to talk." He knew what that meant. No one in the life ever got warned twice. He looked around the apartment one last time. The faded photos, the worn furniture, the life that had somehow become a cage. He put on his jacket, slipped his gold watch off his wrist, and placed it carefully on the table beside his wedding ring. His wife, standing in the doorway, tried not to cry. He kissed her on the cheek, whispered something she didn't catch, and walked out. He never made it to the meeting. The FBI intercepted him before he reached the corner. They'd been watching his phone, waiting. They didn't arrest him this time. They just pulled him into the car and told him straight, "They're gonna kill you, Lefty. You walk in there, you don't walk out." He stared out the window for a long moment, the city lights sliding across his face. "Then what?" he asked. "You gonna keep me in a cage the rest of my life?" The agent didn't answer. Lefty smirked faintly. "Figures," he said. "Everybody's got owe me now." They offered him protection again, but he refused. "I'll take my chances," he said. "You can't hide from your own name." Eventually, they put him back in custody on unrelated charges: loan sharking, conspiracy, gambling. It was a way to keep him alive without admitting it. Prison was safer than freedom, safer than the streets. In that world, irony had a cruel sense of humor. Inside, the other inmates respected him. Lefty carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. He didn't brag, didn't whine, didn't pretend to be a martyr. He played cards, drank bad coffee, told stories about the old days to anyone who'd listen. Sometimes, when the mood was right, he'd talk about Donnie, not with anger, but with something that almost sounded like fondness. "The kid fooled me," he'd say, shaking his head. "You gotta give him that. He did his job. I did mine. We both lost." There was no bitterness in his tone, only truth. Somewhere, deep inside, he understood the strange symmetry of it. Donnie had played his role perfectly. Lefty had played his too. The only difference was that one of them got to go home. Back outside, Joseph Pistone's story became legend. The press turned him into a hero. There were book deals, interviews, talk shows. Hollywood came calling. When the movie Donnie Brasco was released, with Al Pacino playing Lefty and Johnny Depp as Pistone, the world watched their story unfold on screen. But the real Lefty never saw it that way. To him, it wasn't a story. It was his life, stripped bare and repackaged for people who would never understand what it meant to live it. He once told a cellmate, "They made me a punchline, but I ain't no joke. I kept my word. That's all that matters." Years passed. The indictments faded into statistics, the names into footnotes. Lefty's health began to fail. Cancer, the slow kind that eats you from the inside. In 1993, he was released early on compassionate grounds. By then, he was an old man, tired, broke, but still carrying himself like a soldier. He moved into a small apartment, barely spoke to anyone, lived quietly. The Mafia had changed, become slicker, colder, less human. The world he'd known was gone. The new generation didn't care about the code anymore. They cared about profit. Loyalty was a word, not a way of life. Lefty didn't fit anymore. He was a relic from another time, one when silence still meant something. He spent his final years watching the world go on without him. His friends were dead or forgotten. His family had drifted. Sometimes people from the neighborhood would see him sitting by the window, staring out at the street, a cigarette burning down between his fingers. They'd whisper about him, how he'd been betrayed by an undercover cop, how he'd kept his mouth shut, how he'd lived long enough to see the code he believed in turn to dust. Some pitied him. Others envied his stubbornness. But those who really knew understood that what kept him alive wasn't bitterness. It was principle. Even when the life betrayed him, he refused to betray it back. When Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero died in 1994, the obituaries were brief. A few newspapers mentioned his connection to the Donnie Brasco case. A few noted his refusal to cooperate with the government. Most didn't say much else. There was no headline for loyalty in its purest, most tragic form. But in the dim corners of old social clubs, among the last of the old-timers who remembered the code, his name still carried weight. Lefty never flipped, they'd say. He died standing up. In that world, that was as close to sainthood as a man could get. History would remember him as the man who trusted an FBI agent more than his own crew, the mobster betrayed by his best friend. But those who looked deeper saw something else. A man who lived by his own truth, no matter the cost. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't heroic, but he was constant in a world where everything else had fallen apart. That's what made his story more than just another crime saga. It made it human. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes, it comes from the very hand you thought would lift you up. And when it does, all that's left is what you decide to do next. Lefty chose silence. He chose dignity. He chose to go down believing in the same thing that destroyed him. The streets forgot him eventually, as they do everyone. But in the quiet corners of New York, where men still whisper about the old days, his legend lingers, not as a warning, but as a eulogy for a world that no longer exists. The dice had been thrown long ago, and Lefty, stubborn to the end, never asked for a reroll. Chapter 11. The Fall of Sunny Black Napolitano. The sun had barely risen over Brooklyn the morning Dominic Sunny Black Napolitano got the call. The light was pale, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that feels like waiting. He'd been awake all night, pacing his small apartment, his cigarette burning down to the filter, the ashtray already full. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, trucks rumbling, birds calling faintly. But inside, everything was too quiet. He knew before the phone even rang that the call would come. In the life, you always know. You feel in your bones before it reaches your ears. The line between instinct and prophecy becomes paper-thin. The betrayal of Donnie Brasco had hit the Bonanno family like a hammer through glass, and the shards were falling fast. Someone had to take the blame. And Sonny, calm and loyal as he was, understood that the math of the Mafia had no mercy. The numbers never added up in your favor when honor turned to dust. When he picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was gentle, almost respectful. "Sonny," it said, "we gotta talk." That was all. No details. No time. No place mentioned yet. He didn't need them. The meaning was clear, carried in the silence that followed. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. He hung up, stared at the wall for a moment, then nodded to himself. He wasn't going to run. He'd made his peace with the rules a long time ago. You live by the code, you die by the code. He just didn't expect it to be this soon, or this way. He stubbed out his cigarette, took a slow breath, and went to get dressed. He didn't put on his best suit. That's the first sign a man has accepted his fate. You don't want to look like you're dressing for your own funeral. He chose something simple, a dark jacket, plain slacks, the kind of clothes that wouldn't draw attention on a quiet walk through the neighborhood. Before he left, he watered his plants, the small green ones that sat by the window. He'd been proud of them, nurtured them with the same patience he gave to the men under his wing. When he turned to leave, he told his girlfriend, "If I don't come back, water the plants." She nodded, eyes wet, but she didn't try to stop him. There's no stopping a man who's already gone in his mind. The streets of Brooklyn felt heavier that morning, every sound sharper, every step echoing with memory. Sonny walked slowly, like a man tracing his past, each block holding ghosts he couldn't shake. He thought about the nights at the Motion Lounge, about the laughter, the whispers, the quiet deals that had built empires. He thought about Lefty Ruggiero, his loyal soldier and friend, now sitting somewhere between life and death because of the same betrayal that was about to consume him. He thought about Donnie Brasco, the polite, curious kid who'd listened so closely, asked so many questions, who'd fooled them all. Sonny didn't hate him. Oddly enough, he respected him. The kid had done his job too well. It wasn't personal. It was just the game. And Sonny had played long enough to know that the game always wins. The Bonanno family had been in chaos since the revelation. The news that Donnie Brasco was an undercover agent hadn't just embarrassed them. It had humiliated them in front of the entire Mafia commission. Years of rebuilding after Carmine Galani's murder had gone up in smoke. The other families, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese, they laughed behind closed doors. The Bonannos were supposed to be one of the 5 families, pillars of the New York underworld, men of silence and discipline. And yet they had been infiltrated, their meetings recorded, their secrets laid bare in federal files. The commission didn't care who was to blame. Someone had to pay for the insult. And the only men close enough to the source were Sonny Black and Lefty Ruggiero. Inside the family, There was no debate about what needed to be done. The orders came down quietly, without ceremony. You don't argue with the code. You don't plead your case. You just carry it out. By the time Sonny got the call, his fate had already been sealed in rooms he'd never see again. The same men he'd broken bread with, the ones who'd once toasted his promotions, now spoke his name in whispers, afraid to say it too loud. Fear has a way of distorting loyalty in this world. The line between brotherhood and betrayal is a thin one. One day you share a meal, the next you dig a grave. That afternoon, he walked into the apartment building where the meeting was supposed to happen. It was familiar territory, a quiet block, the kind of place where no one asked questions. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy but steady. At the top, two men were waiting. They didn't smile. They didn't greet him with the warmth of old friends. They just nodded once, their faces carved from stone. Sonny understood. There was no need for conversation. Words were meaningless at this point. He stepped inside. The room smelled of dust and oil, the air thick and still. A few chairs, a table, nothing else. No crowd, no audience. Just the executioners and the condemned. Sonny took a deep breath, glanced around once, then straightened his shoulders. "Let's get it over with," he said quietly. The men exchanged a brief look. For a split second, there was something almost regretful in their eyes. Killing a boss wasn't easy, even when it was ordered. But this wasn't about hate. It was about restoring balance. The trigger was pulled. The sound was sharp, final, echoing off the walls like thunder that never rolled away. And then there was silence again. The kind of silence that doesn't fade, it lingers. They left him there for a while before disposing of the body. When they finally moved him, they did it with the same professionalism they brought to every piece of business. Efficient, emotionless. He was buried in a shallow grave, nameless and forgotten for months. It would be nearly a year before the authorities found what was left of him in the basement of a Brooklyn building, his hands still bound, his life reduced to a footnote in a case file. But for the men who knew him, Sonny Black's death wasn't just another casualty of the life. It was the end of something larger, the last flicker of the old-world mafia that believed in loyalty above all else. Back in prison, when Lefty Ruggiero heard the news, he didn't speak for a long time. He sat in his cell, staring at the wall, his cigarette burning down to ash. When another inmate asked if he'd heard, Lefty just nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I heard." Then he looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "They should have taken me, not him." Because in his mind, Sonny was the boss, the man who had always taken responsibility, always protected his crew. Lefty had been the one who vouched for Donnie, the one who brought him close. If anyone deserved to pay, it was him. But the Mafia doesn't deal in fairness. It deals in appearances. And killing Sonny Black was the only way to show the world that the Bonanno family could still police itself. The news of Sonny's murder spread quickly through the streets. In the clubs, the old-timers shook their heads quietly, murmuring that he'd been a good man, a stand-up guy. Younger soldiers learned the lesson the way they always do, in fear. The message was clear. Loyalty doesn't save you. Silence doesn't protect you. In the end, the only thing that matters is survival. And even that's temporary. Everyone in the life understood it now. The old rules had cracked. The Mafia wasn't invincible anymore. The government had found a way inside, not through guns or informants, but through something worse, trust. The FBI didn't celebrate Sonny's death. Even the agents who had worked the case felt the weight of it. Joseph Pistone, the man behind Donnie Brasco, said later that Sonny had been one of the few real men he'd met in the Mafia, a man of principle, however twisted those principles might seem. He respected him, and in his private moments, he carried the guilt of what his undercover work had cost. Because it wasn't just about arrests or convictions. It was about men who'd believed in him, who'd risked their lives for a friendship that never existed. He once said, "If I could have warned Sonny, I would have." But that's not how it works. The rules of one world had destroyed the rules of another. In the months that followed, the Bonanno family limped forward, scarred but still breathing. New leadership emerged. Men colder, more calculated, less romantic about the old days. They rebuilt slowly, shifting operations, changing methods, learning from the disaster that had nearly ended them. But the Donnie Brasco operation had done more than just cripple their ranks. It had exposed the soul of the Mafia itself. It showed the world that the thing they feared most wasn't death or prison. It was betrayal from within. Sonny Black's legacy became a paradox. To the public, he was another mobster, another casualty of the endless cycle of crime and punishment. To the men who'd known him, he was something else entirely, a symbol of dignity in a world that no longer understood it. He'd followed the code to his last breath, even when it demanded his life. That kind of loyalty was rare, even among killers. And that's what made his fall so haunting. Because in the end, he wasn't destroyed by greed or ambition. He was destroyed by faith, faith in a system that had already begun to rot from the inside. For Lefty, the memory of Sonny's death never faded. Even years later, sitting alone in his small apartment after his release, he'd sometimes talk about him quietly, like a man talking to a ghost. Sonny was the last real one. He'd say, he went out like a man. There was pride in his voice when he said it, but also sorrow, because he knew he was speaking about something that no longer existed. The code, the loyalty, the sense of brotherhood that once defined the Mafia. All of it had died with Sonny Black. In the underworld, death rarely means closure. It just changes the shape of the fear. The Bonanno family never fully recovered from the betrayal. They kept moving, kept earning, but the spark was gone. Every handshake carried hesitation. Every new recruit faced suspicion. The streets that once thrived on whispers now echoed with paranoia. The Mafia had always been built on stories, legends of men who lived by honor, who took care of their own, who faced death without blinking. But the story of Sonny Black Napolitano was different. It wasn't about power or revenge. It was about what happens when a man stays true to a code that no longer protects him. In a world where betrayal had become currency, Sonny Black's death was the final payment on a debt the Mafia owed itself. And for men like Lefty, who'd spent their lives believing in the unbreakable bond of brotherhood, it was the last reminder that even the most sacred oaths can be broken, not by enemies, but by time. The code had outlived its usefulness, and those who clung to it were buried with it. Years later, when the younger generation of mobsters heard the name Sonny Black, they barely remembered the details. They knew he'd been betrayed. They knew he died quietly, without begging, but they didn't understand what that meant. They didn't know that his death marked the end of something larger than a man. It was the end of an era, the end of the illusion that honor could survive in a world built on lies. And somewhere, beneath the noise of the city that had forgotten him, the plants he'd asked to have watered kept growing, silent, steady, reaching toward the light he never got to see again. Chapter 12. The Trial and the Aftermath. The courtroom was silent in that strange, heavy way that only happens before history takes its breath. Rows of wooden benches filled with reporters, agents, lawyers, and curious faces from a city that had lived too long in the shadow of men like Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. The lights were too bright, the air too clean, the sound of shuffling papers echoing like whispers of judgment. Lefty sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes low, dressed in a simple suit that looked a size too big. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink. He looked like a man who'd already served his sentence long before the first gavel struck. For him, this wasn't a trial. It was the slow unspooling of a life that had already ended. The prosecutor spoke first, their voices sharp and confident. They laid out the evidence, the tapes, the photos, the testimonies. They painted the picture of a man deeply embedded in organized crime, a soldier of the Bonanno family who had shaken down businesses, collected debts, and carried out the dirty work that kept the machine running. They spoke of Donnie Brasco, the undercover operation that changed everything, showing the jury how an FBI agent had walked into the heart of the Mafia and brought it to its knees. They didn't need to dramatize it. The story told itself. 6 years undercover, hundreds of hours of recordings, a web of secrets that exposed the inner workings of a world most people thought untouchable. The courtroom gasped in all the right places. Every exhibit, Every piece of evidence, every detail of that operation had been designed to shock. And it worked. When it was the defense's turn, there was no grandstanding. No speeches about innocence or justice. Lefty's lawyer, an old hand who'd seen too many mob cases, knew better than to argue the facts. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, he tried to humanize the man sitting beside him, to turn Benjamin Ruggiero from a faceless gangster into something more complex. He's not a monster, the lawyer said quietly. He's a man who followed a code that destroyed him. It was a simple line, but it lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Because it was true. The law didn't care about codes, but the jury did. For the first time, they looked at Lefty not as a villain, but as a relic of a world that had devoured itself. Lefty didn't speak much during the proceedings. He sat through testimony after testimony. FBI agents describing his meetings, former associates testifying for lighter sentences, tapes played where his voice filled the room like a ghost from another life. He listened without emotion, eyes fixed on the table. Occasionally, he'd smirk faintly, the kind of grim half-smile that carried no joy, just irony. The irony of a man who'd lived by silence, now hearing his own words echoing through a courtroom full of strangers. The recordings were damning. Conversations about collections, gambling, loans, hierarchy, orders from the top. He didn't need to be caught with a gun in his hand. His words were enough. When the prosecution played the tape where Lefty spoke proudly about his kid, Donnie, the room went still. You could hear the sadness hidden in his voice, the genuine affection he'd had for the man who deceived him. He's solid, he'd said on that tape. He's one of us. It wasn't evidence of a crime. It was evidence of tragedy. The courtroom didn't realize it, but they were listening to a confession of love disguised as loyalty. Every syllable carried the echo of betrayal. Donnie Brasco, the ghost in the room, wasn't there to face him, but his presence hung over everything, invisible but undeniable. The jury didn't take long. The verdict was guilty. It was always going to be. When the foreman read the decision, Lefty didn't flinch. He just nodded once, as if confirming what he'd already known before the trial even began. The sentence was heavy, though not the worst it could have been. 20 years. By then, he was already an old man. 20 years might as well have been life. But he didn't care. To him, dying free or dying locked up didn't matter. He'd already lost the only thing that made life worth anything. The belief that loyalty could still save a man. In prison, time moved differently. The days stretched into years, and the world outside moved on. The Mafia kept changing, modernizing, shedding its old skin. The new generation cared less about honor and more about profit. They wore suits instead of leather jackets, used lawyers instead of hitmen. The code that Lefty had lived and killed for was dying, replaced by greed and technology. Behind bars, he watched it all from afar, reading about it in newspapers, hearing whispers from new inmates who barely remembered the names that once commanded fear. It was like watching your own language vanish, syllable by syllable. He kept to himself most of the time, quiet, polite, but distant. He played cards, drank instant coffee, and told stories to younger inmates who asked what it used to be like. Sometimes he'd talk about the old bosses, Galante, Bonanno, Rostelli, and his eyes would light up just for a moment. They were different, he'd say. Back then, there were rules. You knew where you stood. Nowadays, nobody knows nothing. The younger guys listened like he was describing mythology. To them, it was ancient history. To Lefty, it was life. The world he'd built his identity around had vanished, and all that remained was memory. The Bureau checked in on him occasionally, partly out of duty, partly out of guilt. They'd save his life once, after all, though not in the way he would have wanted. To them, he was a survivor of their greatest operation. To him, they were the architects of his ruin. Still, he never spat hatred at them. He'd look the agents in the eye, give a tired shrug, and say, "You did your job. I did mine." That was his way of forgiving them, or maybe forgiving himself. Even Joseph Pistone, years later, would admit that Lefty was the one man he truly regretted hurting. He didn't deserve it, Pistone said. He was old school. He had honor. But regret, like loyalty, comes too late in that world. As the years rolled by, Lefty's health began to fail. The long nights of cigarettes, cheap whiskey, and stress finally caught up to him. The doctors said cancer. He said nothing. He didn't believe in complaining. Pain was part of the life. He'd seen men take bullets without blinking. What was a tumor compared to that? When he was released early in the 90s due to his condition, he walked out of prison thinner, slower, but unbroken. He went home to a city that no longer recognized him. The neighborhood had changed. The clubs were gone. The faces were new. The kids on the corners didn't even know his name. The life he bled for had become folklore, told in whispers and movies. He lived quietly, alone, in a small apartment with barely enough furniture to fill it. Some nights, he'd sit by the window, smoke curling through the room, watching the world go by below. Sometimes he'd mutter to himself, half out of habit, half out of memory. "Never rat," he'd whisper. "Never talk." It wasn't bravado. It was prayer, a way of reminding himself that he'd kept his word when nothing else had stayed true. To men like him, that meant everything. The movie Donnie Brasco came out in 1997, 3 years after his death. Al Pacino played him, grizzled, tired, loyal to a fault. The world watched his story unfold on the big screen, turn into entertainment for people who'd never walked in his shoes. Critics praised the performance, called it tragic, human, heartbreaking. But to those who'd known the real Lefty, it wasn't a movie. It was an open wound. It showed him as the world saw him, a fool for loyalty, a relic of a dying code. What it didn't show was the quiet strength, the small kindnesses, the strange dignity of a man who'd never once betrayed the thing that betrayed him first. When his name appeared briefly at the end of the film, a line of text marking his fate, the audience saw closure. But there was no closure in real life. The FBI had dismantled the Bonannos, yes, but they hadn't killed the idea of the Mafia. They just changed it. The new generation of criminals didn't wear fedoras or speak Sicilian. They wore suits, ran banks, moved money with computers. The streets were quieter, but the corruption was cleaner. The ghosts of men like Lefty lingered in the cracks, in the stories told by those who still remembered the smell of gunpowder and cigars, the sound of laughter over espresso, the unspoken laws that had ruled their lives. The trial had been just one piece of a larger unraveling. The Mafia's myth had been built on the illusion of control, the belief that silence could protect you, that loyalty could make you immortal. But Donnie Brasco's infiltration had shattered that illusion forever. It proved that even the most secret society in America could be undone by trust. That's what haunted the survivors most. Not the arrests, not the convictions, but the idea that they'd been beaten not by force, but by faith. They believed in a man, and that belief had destroyed them. In the end, Lefty's story became more than just another chapter in Mafia history. It became a reflection of the world that created him, a world where the line between honor and destruction was razor thin. The courtroom, the indictments, the betrayal, they were just the final act of a tragedy that had begun decades earlier in the streets of Little Italy, when a young man decided that the life of a gangster was better than being forgotten. And maybe he was right, because even in death, even after the trial, after the headlines faded, people still said his name. They said it softly, almost reverently. Lefty Ruggiero, they'd whisper, the one who didn't talk. The story of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero is the story of an entire generation of men who lived by rules that no longer made sense in the world around them. They believed in loyalty as if it were religion, in silence as if it were salvation. And when the world moved on, they stayed behind, trapped in the echo of their own promises. The trial didn't convict Lefty, it revealed him. It showed the world who he truly was, a flawed, faithful man who played a game that no one could win. When the gavel fell for the last time, the courtroom emptied, the reporters left, and the world went back to spinning. But for those who knew the life, that sound, the final crack of wood against wood, wasn't just the end of a case. It was the sound of an era ending, the sound of the code breaking, the sound of the last old-school gangster watching his world fade to silence. Chapter 13, The end of the old guard. It was a gray morning in New York City, the kind where the sky seems to sag under its own weight and the air feels thick with memory. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero walked slowly along the sidewalk, his steps uneven, the rhythm of a man who had lived too long with ghosts. The years had stripped him down, his body weaker, his hair thin and white, his eyes dulled but still sharp when they caught the light. The world around him had changed beyond recognition. The bars he used to haunt were gone, replaced by coffee shops and glass storefronts. The old social clubs that once pulsed with laughter, fear, and whispered deals were now dry cleaners or abandoned shells. The Mafia he'd known, the world he'd lived and died for, had disappeared like smoke into the city air. What was left of it? What was left of him? Was memory, fading but still stubbornly alive. He moved like a man haunted by the echoes of his own life. Every street corner had a story. Every alley was a ghost. He could still picture the old crew, standing on corners in their suits, their cigarettes glowing under the streetlights, the smell of cologne and gun oil mixing in the cold. He remembered Sonny Black's calm voice, the way he used to tap his fingers on the table before making a decision. He remembered Galani's arrogance, Rostelli's quiet authority, the laughter, the arguments, the deals that once decided who lived and who didn't. Now there was nothing. Just him, an old soldier without a war. The city didn't care about men like Lefty anymore. It moved on, fast and loud, full of new money and empty ambition. The Mafia's glory days had been buried under skyscrapers and stock markets. The violence, the loyalty, the silence, it was all outdated. The newspapers no longer wrote about the families unless it was to mock them, to call them relics of a bygone era. But to Lefty, it hadn't been an era. It had been life. It had been everything. He still woke up before dawn, out of habit more than purpose. He'd sit by the window with a cup of bitter coffee, smoke curling through the air, and watch the city wake up. He didn't talk much to anyone anymore. Most of the people who might have called were dead or hiding. The ones who weren't wanted nothing to do with the past. They'd found new rackets, new ways to make money without blood on their hands. But Lefty couldn't adapt. He was built for a world that no longer existed. He had spent his life learning the rules of silence, the rituals of respect, the unspoken codes that kept men alive. And then one day, those rules stopped mattering. The world had rewritten itself without asking for permission. Sometimes he'd take the subway just to be around people, to hear the noise of the living. He'd watch kids with headphones, businessmen with their phones, women rushing past with purpose. None of them looked up. None of them saw him. He was invisible now, like the shadows of the old clubs that had once owned this city. The old guard had always believed in power through fear, but fear fades when the stories stop being told. The next generation didn't believe in the Mafia anymore. To them, it was a myth, something from movies and bedtime stories. They didn't understand that for men like Lefty, it wasn't myth, it was blood, sweat, and unspoken promises. At night, when the city quieted down, he'd pour himself a drink and listen to old songs on the radio, songs from the days when the world still made sense. The kind of songs that used to play in bars where soldiers of the life laughed about the feds, about bad luck, about how long the next guy would last. Those songs were like ghosts too, drifting through his apartment, carrying the voices of men who were gone. Sometimes he talked to them out loud, muttering under his breath, as if the walls still remembered. The end of the old guard hadn't come with a single bullet or a single betrayal. It came slowly, like rust spreading over steel. One by one, the old names vanished. Some were killed, some flipped, some died in prison forgotten. The new generation of mobsters didn't even bother to honor them. There were no wakes, no gatherings, no whispered stories about the way it used to be. The code was broken, and once it broke, there was no putting it back together. Men like Lefty were dinosaurs, wandering through a city that had evolved past them. He still got letters sometimes, strange ones from strangers who'd read about him or seen the movie. They'd write things like, "You were my favorite character," or "You were the last real gangster." He never wrote back. He didn't see himself as a character. He wasn't a legend. He was a man who made choices, some bad, some worse, and lived long enough to see what they cost. He'd once told Donnie that the life only ends one of three ways. You die young, you die in prison, or you die alone. He hadn't realized then that he'd be the proof of the third. The years after his release blurred together. The FBI had let him go not out of mercy, but exhaustion. He wasn't a threat anymore. The Bonanno family didn't come for him. Maybe they'd forgotten, or maybe they thought death would get him first. Either way, he was free, but freedom meant nothing to a man with nowhere left to go. He spent his days quietly, drifting through the city like a ghost with a pulse. The only people who still recognized him were journalists or law students looking for a quote. They'd find him, ask him what it had been like, what he thought about Donnie Brasco now. He'd always say the same thing. He did his job. I did mine. That was the closest thing to forgiveness he ever offered. Sometimes he wondered what Donnie was doing now, where he lived, if he ever thought about him. He imagined him in some quiet town under his real name, living like a man who'd seen too much. Maybe he still carried guilt. Maybe he didn't. Lefty couldn't decide which was worse. There had been nights in prison when he'd dreamt of Donnie walking through the door, sitting down across from him, explaining it all. But the dream always ended before he could ask the one question that mattered. Why? Not why he did it. Lefty understood that part. Why he'd made it so real. Why he'd made friendship feel like truth. When the news of Sonny Black's death reached him, years after the fact, Lefty didn't cry. He didn't even speak. He just sat there, motionless, the cigarette burning down in his hand until it scorched his skin. He felt the pain, but didn't move. Sonny had been a boss, but more than that, he'd been a believer. He believed in the same things Lefty did: respect, loyalty, silence. And he died for it. Lefty lived, but he never felt like he'd survived. Surviving means continuing. He didn't continue. He just existed. Every day was the same. Wake up. Smoke. Remember. Regret. The Mafia had been more than just a criminal network. It had been a way of life, a mirror for the men who refused to be small. In their world, power wasn't about wealth or politics. It was about control. You controlled fear. You controlled silence. And in return, the world gave you something close to immortality. But immortality is a lie, just like loyalty. In the end, everyone fades, no matter how loud their name once was. Lefty knew that better than anyone. He used to think death came fast, with a gunshot or a knife or a betrayal. But real death comes slowly, as the world forgets you. The final years of his life passed in near total obscurity. He moved less, spoke less, spent most of his time staring out the window. The neighbors barely noticed him. The kids on the block didn't know who he was. To them, he was just another old man feeding pigeons. But the ghosts never left. He'd see them sometimes in reflections, in flashes of memory. Sonny sitting at the table with his coffee, Galante smirking behind a cigar, the Zips whispering in Sicilian, Donnie laughing softly in the corner. They'd flicker and fade, like smoke caught in sunlight. He didn't try to chase them away. They were all he had left. He never complained. He never blamed anyone for how it all ended. Not the FBI, not Donnie, not the family. The life had its rules, and he had broken none of them. That, in his mind, was victory. He'd outlived almost everyone, even if he hadn't won. The newspapers called him the man who never talked, and maybe that was true. But silence isn't just the absence of speech. It's the sound of everything that was lost. And for Lefty, that silence was deafening. In the end, he went quietly, just as he'd lived. No headlines, no crowds, just a man in a chair, the city humming faintly outside his window. They found him there one morning, the cigarette burned out beside his hand. His body was thin, but his face looked calm, as if he'd finally found peace in the only way a man like him could, alone. There was no funeral, no procession. A few relatives claimed the body, buried him quietly in a small cemetery. No one left flowers. No one told stories. The world moved on. But somewhere his legend lived, not in the papers or the movies, but in the hearts of those who still believed the old ways meant something. In the back rooms of what was left of the Mafia, in the quiet corners where whispers still mattered, They spoke his name with a kind of reverence. Lefty, they'd say. He never broke. He never talked. And for them, that was enough. Because in their world, that was all a man could hope for, to die standing, even if no one was watching. The story of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero isn't one of victory or defeat. It's a story about time, about how every empire, criminal or otherwise, eventually crumbles, and how the men who built it are left standing in the ruins, wondering if it was ever real. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a monster. He was something in between, the last echo of an era when loyalty could kill you, and silence was the only truth that still mattered. And when the last of the old guard fell, the world didn't notice. But somewhere deep in the bones of the city, the streets did. They remembered. They always do. Chapter 14, Ghosts of Loyalty. The rain fell soft that morning, the kind that didn't pour or flash, but lingered. Thin, endless, steady. It washed down the cracked sidewalks of Lower Manhattan, down the faces of old buildings that had seen everything and learned to keep their silence. In a small apartment 3 stories up, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero sat by the window, watching the city blur behind the streaks of water. He'd always loved the rain. It reminded him of the sound of 1,000 cigarette burns, of cars idling outside late-night bars, of footsteps fading into the dark. But now it was something else entirely. The sound wasn't comforting anymore. It was memory, endless and heavy, filling the spaces that silence couldn't. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, the cigarette between his fingers burning unevenly. Age had softened him, but it hadn't dulled the sharp edges of his mind. The ghosts were still there, everywhere, and every one of them had a face he couldn't forget. He thought of Sonny Black first. He always did. The man who had gone to his death with quiet dignity, who hadn't begged, who hadn't run. "If I don't come back," Sonny had said once, "take care of the plants." It was such a simple thing to say before walking toward death, and yet it held everything. Responsibility, honor, a strange tenderness that didn't belong in their world. Lefty had lived long enough to see the plants outlast the men who watered them. That's what haunted him most. Not the betrayals, not the prisons, not the years wasted, but the small, human moments that outlived the people who made them. They were ghosts too, in their own way. He poured himself a drink, the liquid sloshing softly in the glass. His doctor had told him to stop years ago, but the doctor didn't know what it meant to be alone. You couldn't tell a man who had lived his life surrounded by noise, by laughter, gunshots, curses, and whispered deals, to suddenly live in quiet. Quiet wasn't peace. Quiet was a punishment. He took a slow sip, the taste harsh but grounding. The television hummed faintly in the background, the same recycled news stories, the same faces talking about things that didn't matter. He kept it on for the sound more than anything. The silence was too loud otherwise. Every once in a while, someone from the old life would call, a voice he hadn't heard in decades. "Hey, Lefty," they'd say, as if no time had passed at all. They'd talk about the old days for a few minutes, about who got locked up, who died, who started talking, and then the conversation would trail off into nothing. The calls always ended the same way. Stay safe. But they all knew safety didn't exist anymore. Not for them. Not for anyone who'd ever belonged to the life. The life didn't just end when you walked away. It followed you. It lived inside you like a second heartbeat, one that never stopped, even when everything else did. The world outside his window was faster now, colder. Kids walked by with their faces lit by the glow of phones, talking to people miles away but blind to the ones next to them. No one looked around anymore. No one watched. That was the biggest change. In Lefty's time, watching was survival. You learned people by their walk, their voice, the way their eyes shifted when they lied. Now, nobody looked at anything. Maybe that's why the world felt less dangerous, he thought. Or maybe it just meant no one cared enough to see the danger anymore. Sometimes, people asked him if he missed it. The life, the action, the money, the rush. He always said no, but it wasn't the truth. He missed parts of it, the rhythm of it, the sense of belonging. He missed walking into a room, where everyone knew his name, where respect wasn't a word but a weight you could feel in the air. He missed the certainty that came with being part of something, even something corrupt, because at least back then, he knew who he was. Now, he wasn't sure. Was he Benjamin Ruggiero, the man who'd been betrayed? Or Lefty, the soldier who never broke? He wasn't sure anymore where one ended and the other began. The Donnie Brasco case had made him famous in ways he never wanted. People called him the mobster betrayed by his best friend, but that wasn't the whole story. Donnie hadn't been just his friend. He'd been his hope, his proof that he still mattered in a world that had started to forget him. When Donnie disappeared and the truth came out, something inside Lefty cracked. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. All those years of teaching, of guiding, of protecting, it meant nothing now. It had all been a lie. And yet, even knowing that, he couldn't bring himself to hate the man. He'd thought about it, tried to summon anger, but what came instead was something closer to pity. He did his job, Lefty would mutter to himself sometimes. And I did mine. The words tasted bitter, but they were true. That was the hardest part, knowing that neither of them had been wrong, and both had still lost everything. In the quiet of his apartment, the phone rang again one evening. He stared at it for a while before answering. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. It was a journalist, another one chasing the legend. They always wanted quotes, the sound bites that would make headlines. "Mr. Ruggiero," the voice said, "we're doing a piece about loyalty in the Mafia, about how it's changed. Can we talk to you?" Lefty chuckled dryly. "Changed," he said. "It didn't change. It died." The journalist hesitated. "What do you mean?" Lefty leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Loyalty only works if everyone believes in it. Once one guy stops believing, it's over. You can't bring it back. You can't fix it. That's what happened to us. We stopped believing." The voice on the other end went quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" Lefty didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "You can't regret something you didn't choose. The life chooses you. You just hope it spits you out before it eats you whole." The call ended, but the words stayed in his head long after. He hadn't planned to say them. They just come out. Maybe it was the truth. Maybe it was just the whiskey talking. Either way, it left him restless. That night, he didn't sleep much. He lay awake listening to the hum of the city, the distant sirens, the occasional shouts from the street below. New York never really slept. It just changed masks. He thought about the faces that had come and gone, the countless men who had believed they were untouchable, all of them gone now. And in their absence, he wondered if they'd ever really mattered at all. The Bonanno family still existed, technically, but it wasn't the same. The structure was weaker, the respect thinner, the code fractured. Too many rats, too many deals, too many men trading loyalty for leniency. In his day, men would rather die than talk. Now, they talked before the handcuffs were even tight. Lefty understood survival, but he didn't understand that kind of surrender. "If you can't take the weight," he once said, "you don't deserve a life." But nobody cared about weight anymore. The life wasn't about pride now. It was about profit. Everything had turned into business, and business had no soul. In his later years, Lefty would sometimes find himself walking near the old docks where he and Donnie had once stood, talking about deals, dreams, and things that no longer mattered. The water still smelled the same: salt, rust, decay. He'd lean on the railing, light a cigarette, and stare at the horizon. The world was quieter out there. He could almost imagine the ghosts standing beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Sonny, Donnie, all the lost names. For a moment, it would feel like the past wasn't gone at all, just sleeping. Then a horn would blare, a ferry would pass, and the illusion would break. He'd smile faintly, flick the ash into the wind, and whisper, "Fugga to but it," like a prayer to no one. The cancer came slow, creeping through his lungs like smoke filling a room. He didn't fight it. He'd fought enough in his life. When the doctors told him how bad it was, he just nodded. "Figures," he said. "Took everything else. Might as well take me." He spent his last months mostly indoors, his body growing weaker, his world shrinking to the space between his bed and the window. The city kept moving, oblivious. That's how life works. It doesn't pause for anyone. One afternoon, a nurse found him sitting by the window again, his eyes fixed on the rain. "You think it ever ends?" she asked softly, trying to make conversation. He turned his head slowly, his smile faint but warm. "Nothing ends," he said. "It just changes shape." Those were some of the last words he ever spoke. When he died, it was quiet, almost gentle. No one around him. No headlines. Just the rain, tapping against the glass like it always had. The papers wrote small blurbs. Mafia associate Benjamin Ruggiero dies of cancer at 68. No mention of loyalty or betrayal or the strange grace of a man who had lived by a dying code. The world moved on, as it always does. But the underworld remembered. They always do. Among the few who still whispered his name, he was remembered not for his crimes, but for something rarer, for never breaking the silence. Years later, when people spoke of the old Mafia, they spoke of Lefty Ruggiero like they spoke of myths. A relic, a ghost, a man who lived long enough to see his world turn to dust and still refused to curse it. His story became less about crime and more about what it means to believe in something, even when it destroys you. In a world where everyone eventually talks, he didn't. And maybe that was his revenge, not on the FBI, not on Donnie, not even on fate, but on time itself. Because time forgets everything, except those who refuse to bend. And so the rain kept falling, as it always had, washing over a city that didn't care and a history that wouldn't die. Somewhere in that noise, if you listen closely, you could still hear the faint whisper of a man's voice, gruff but steady, saying what he'd always said: "I did my time. I did it right. I never talked." The last of the old guard. The last ghost of loyalty. Chapter 15. The Last Conversation. The wind that night was sharp, carrying the kind of chill that slipped through window cracks and whispered of winter. The city lights blinked far below like dying embers, the sound of distant traffic rising and falling like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero sat in his chair by the window, the same spot he'd sat in for years, watching New York move without him. The ashtray beside him overflowed, his cigarette burning low, untouched. He didn't need to smoke anymore. He just liked the way the light from the tip glowed in the dark, like proof that something was still alive. The clock ticked somewhere behind him, steady, indifferent. He'd stopped keeping track of time. Time was for people with plans. He didn't have any left. All that remained were the ghosts of old conversations, looping quietly in his mind, pieces of dialogue that would never find an ending. He was thinking about Donnie again. He always did at night. Not the FBI agent, not the man who dismantled his world, but Donnie, the kid from the bars, the one who listened, who laughed, who treated him like family. He could still see that face, smiling, curious, pretending to belong, but somehow fitting in perfectly. It had all been fake, and yet it hadn't. That's what tore Lefty apart all these years later. Because in some twisted way, the friendship had been real, even if everything else was a lie. He didn't know if Donnie ever thought about him, but sometimes, when the city was quiet enough, he imagined they were both awake somewhere, staring out windows, haunted by the same memory. Maybe that was the only kind of loyalty left, the kind that comes after everything else is gone. He coughed, the sound ragged wet. The cancer had made breathing its own kind of punishment. Every inhale felt like scraping against glass. The doctor said there wasn't much time left, but he'd heard that before. He'd survived too many things that should have killed him to believe in predictions. Still, he could feel it this time, the slow fade, the narrowing of the world. He wasn't afraid. Death didn't scare men like him. It was the silence afterward that did. Because silence was worse than dying. It meant being forgotten. A letter sat unopened on the table beside him. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. It had come a week ago from somewhere out west. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Pistone, Donnie, whatever name he went by now. He thought about burning it, about tossing into the ashtray and watching the flame eat it alive. But he hadn't. Instead, he just let it sit there, like an unspoken challenge. He didn't know what the letter said, and he didn't want to. He preferred the uncertainty. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a goodbye. He didn't deserve either, and he didn't want them. But still, he couldn't throw it away. Not yet. He thought about the night before the FBI took him in, the call that was supposed to end him. "Come down, we gotta talk." He could still hear the voice on the other end, calm, controlled, polite. The voice of death pretending to be a friend. He'd known what was waiting for him, but he'd gone anyway. That was the thing about the code. You didn't hide. You faced it, even if it meant walking into your own execution. The feds had stopped him, saved him in their way, but it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like theft. They'd robbed him of the one thing he still had, his right to choose how to go out. That's what he hated most. Not Donnie's betrayal, not the arrests, not the humiliation, just that he never got to walk into that room, never got to face the end on his own terms. He picked up his drink, swirling the amber liquid slowly. His hand shook, but the motion steadied him somehow. The smell reminded him of every backroom meeting he'd ever sat through. The stale cigars, the low laughter, the whispers of deals that changed lives and ended others. He used to think he understood power back then, but power was an illusion. The real power wasn't in fear or money. It was in memory, in being remembered. And that, he realized, was what the Mafia had truly stolen from all of them. Not just their lives, but their legacy. They'd built a world out of loyalty and silence. And in the end, both had betrayed them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the city outside. He wondered how many of the people down there knew his name. Probably none. To them, he was just another story from a movie, another face in a documentary, another line in a history book that would never capture the truth. They called him the mobster betrayed by his best friend. It sounded poetic, cinematic. But the real story wasn't about betrayal. It was about belief. He believed in something that no longer existed. And belief, he thought, was the most dangerous addiction of all. The phone rang once. Then again. He hesitated, staring at it, the shrill sound slicing through the quiet. He picked it up on the third ring. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracked. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then a voice, older now, softer. "Hey, Lefty." He froze. The sound of it hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't say anything. "It's been a long time," the voice continued. Lefty swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah," he finally said. "Too long." Another pause. "You got my letter?" He looked at it across the room. "Yeah," he said again. "Didn't read it." A faint chuckle came through the line. "I figured." The air between them felt thick, heavy with everything that had gone unsaid for decades. "You mad?" Donnie asked quietly. Lefty took a long breath. "Mad? Nah," he said, shaking his head. "You did what you had to do. I get it. I don't hold it." He meant it, but the words hurt coming out. "I just wish," he added after a moment, "you told me who you were before you left. You owed me that much." There was silence. Then Donnie said, "If I had, you'd be dead. You know that." Lefty chuckled, dry and bitter. "Yeah, but at least I'd have gone out knowing the truth." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the rain filling the space where forgiveness should have been. "You ever think about it?" Lefty asked. "What we did? How it ended?" Donnie sighed. "Every day," he said. "I didn't want to hurt you, Lefty. You were the only one who ever treated me like family." The words hit hard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were honest. Lefty nodded slowly. "You were family," he said quietly. "That's the funny part. Even when I found out, I couldn't hate you. I tried, believe me, but I couldn't. That's the thing about loyalty. It don't switch off just 'cause you got fooled." Donnie didn't reply. Lefty could hear his breathing, steady but distant. He imagined him sitting in some small house, alone, probably looking out a window too. "You ever miss it?" Donnie asked finally. Lefty smiled faintly. "The life? Nah, not the killing, not the bullshit. I miss the people, the ones who didn't make it out. You can't replace that kind of thing. There's something about sitting in a smoky room with men who die before they talked. You don't see that anymore. Now everybody talks." He took another sip of his drink. "Even me, I guess." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The line crackled faintly. "You know," Lefty said, "they made a movie about you. About us." Donnie chuckled softly. Yeah, I heard. Lefty smirked. Pacino played me. Can you believe that? Got it all right, I guess. They both laughed, the sound strained but real. For a moment, it almost felt like old times again. Two men sharing a joke in a world that no longer existed. They made you look good, Donnie said. Maybe too good. Yeah, Lefty replied. They always make dead men look better in the movies. The laughter faded. The silence returned. Lefty stared at the clock. So what now, he asked. You call me after all these years. What for? Donnie hesitated. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Lefty didn't move. You said that already. Yeah, Donnie said softly. But I needed to say it to you. Not to the world. Not to reporters. To you. Lefty nodded, though Donnie couldn't see it. All right, he said. Then you said it. Another pause. You forgive me? Lefty thought for a long time before answering. Forgive? That's a big word. I don't know if I got that in me. But I ain't mad, if that count for something. Donnie's voice broke slightly. It counts. When the call ended, Lefty sat there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing softly in his ear. He finally hung up, leaned back, and exhaled. His eyes burned, but no tears came. He'd never been much for crying. It wasn't in his nature. The world had taken too much from him to leave room for tears. But something inside him felt lighter, just a little. Like a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying had shifted. Maybe that was forgiveness, he thought. Not a word, not a feeling, just the quiet acceptance that some things couldn't have gone any other way. The next morning, the nurse found him sitting in the same chair, the window open, the cigarette burned down to the filter. The city was alive outside, humming, restless, endless. He looked peaceful, his eyes half open, the faintest trace of a smile still on his face. On the table beside him sat the letter, unopened still, but beside it now lay the phone, its receiver resting in his lap. It looked almost like he'd just finished a conversation. When word of his death spread, it didn't make headlines. The world barely noticed. There were no processions, no flowers, no crowds. But in the corners of Little Italy, in dim bars where the ghosts still gathered, they talked about him. Not as a rat, not as a failure, but as something else. A man who had kept his word when no one else did. A man who never flipped, never begged, never forgot. Lefty, they'd say, raising their glasses. He was the last of them, and maybe he was. The last of the old guard. The last man who believed the code could outlive corruption, who went to his grave without betraying the thing that made him who he was. In the end, he didn't need monuments or headlines. He had his silence. He had his story. And he had one final conversation that, for the first time in his life, ended with peace instead of pain. Outside, the wind carried his smoke into the night. The city moved on, unaware that one of its last ghosts had finally gone quiet. But somewhere, in a small house far away, another old man sat staring at the same sky, a phone still warm in his hand, whispering a name that the world had already forgotten. "Good night, Lefty," he said softly. "Sleep easy." And for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed didn't feel like punishment. It felt like closure.